Welcome to Sleepy Whisper. Before we begin, please set your volume to a gentle level, close your eyes, lie still, and let the quiet take you. Tonight, we start drifting into sleep with the very first story in our Boring History for Sleep series. It is called Salt Roads of the Sahara. Let the calm words carry you far away. If you enjoy this journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so every night you can return here to rest. The desert lies vast and quiet, an endless sea of sand stretching farther than the eye can follow, a place where the horizon blurs and the line between earth and sky dissolves into pale shimmering light. For thousands of years, this immense landscape was not empty, but carried one of the strangest and most enduring highways in human history, the salt roads of the Sahara. Imagine the silence of the dunes at dusk, broken only by the steady, deliberate footsteps of camels, each one carrying blocks of salt as precious as gold. These were not short journeys. Caravans would cross weeks of sun and wind, their path guided not by stone markers or written maps, but by memory, by stories, and by stars that glittered sharply in the unpolluted sky. Salt, the mineral that kept food from spoiling, that flavored the simplest meal, and that was sometimes weighed against gold itself, was worth the risk of the journey. The people of the desert, the Tuareg and other nomadic groups, became guardians of these roads, their lives tied to the rhythm of caravans that departed, disappeared, and one day returned. A single camel could carry hundreds of pounds of salt, but a caravan might be hundreds of camels long, stretching across the flat horizon like a moving line of patience and endurance. Each block of salt was cut from mines in places like Taoudeni in Mali, where workers dug into the earth in suffocating heat, lifting slabs of white stone from the crust of an ancient sea long vanished. These blocks, shaped into rectangles, were stacked and tied onto the backs of animals, beginning their long passage southward. Towns that today may seem small and remote once thrived because of this trade. Timbuktu, for instance, a name that to many people sounds almost mythical, grew as a center where salt met gold, where merchants exchanged stories, and where knowledge itself flowed along with goods. To imagine these roads is to picture more than just trade. It is to think of men wrapped in indigo veils to protect from the sun, of campfires flickering at night while the desert cold settled in, of songs sung to pass the time and to soothe the camels, of distant wells remembered across the sands, each one the difference between survival and death. The desert was harsh, yet it was also predictable in its silence. Caravans moved like clockwork, not fast, not loud, but steady. The pace itself was part of the design, for in the Sahara, one could not hurry. Water had to be rationed, steps measured, rest carefully taken in the shade of makeshift tents or beneath the stars themselves. Every journey was both a test of endurance and a ritual, repeated countless times across generations. To those who lived in Europe or distant kingdoms, salt might simply arrive as a finished good, but for those of the desert, salt was a story. It told of men who braved dust storms that could blot out the sun, of animals that knew the path instinctively, of traders who trusted one another with their lives as well as their goods. The Sahara was not an empty void. It was a stage where history unfolded quietly, without monuments or battlefields, but with the endless march of caravans carrying white slabs across golden sands. Even today, in some places, echoes of this ancient trade survive. There are still mines, still blocks of salt carved out by hand, still camels walking across dunes, their shadows stretching long in the evening light. The world may have changed, but in the desert, time lingers. The salt roads remind us that history is not only in great empires or sudden events, but also in the steady persistence of human need, and in the way communities adapt to harshness with resilience and ritual. As you listen, imagine the slow sway of a camel's gait, the creak of ropes holding the salt, the dry wind brushing against your face, and the quiet rhythm of footsteps that go on without end. This is the beginning of our journey into the salt roads of the Sahara, a history that is patient, silent, and enduring, much like the desert itself. As the caravan moved deeper into the desert, each day blended slowly into the next, marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the rising and setting of the sun and the endless rhythm of the march. Dawn came with a pale glow on the horizon, the air still cool from the night, a moment of quiet before the sun began its relentless climb. The traders would rise early, pack their tents, and load the camels once more, tightening ropes, checking water skins, and securing the precious salt blocks that had already traveled so far. By mid-morning, the heat pressed down like an invisible weight, and the desert seemed to shimmer, as though the land itself were bending under the sun. The air was so dry that even words seemed to vanish, swallowed before they could travel far. Conversation grew sparse, replaced by silence and the steady creak of leather straps. Salt was not the only thing that moved along these roads. The caravans also carried news, ideas, and sometimes manuscripts copied by hand, works of science, religion, or poetry that would later find their way into the libraries of towns like Timbuktu. In this way, the desert was both a barrier and a bridge. It separated communities with its vast emptiness, yet it also connected them through the trade that forced passage across it. Every caravan was part of a chain, a link between the distant salt mines of the north and the markets of the south where gold dust glimmered in scales and jars. The exchange of salt for gold became legendary, but other goods too moved across these routes: cloth, beads, ivory, and sometimes even enslaved people, a darker thread woven into the history of the desert roads. The Tuareg, who guided many of these caravans, carried with them traditions passed down through centuries. Their blue veils, dyed with indigo, left faint traces of color on their skin, earning them the name, the Blue Men of the Desert. Their knowledge of the land was unmatched, for they knew which wells could be trusted, which dunes shifted too quickly, which routes would hold firm underfoot, and which valleys might trap a caravan in sudden storms. At night, when the sun finally sank and the heat fell away, the desert changed character. The stars emerged in numbers almost unimaginable to those who lived in cities. Entire constellations shone clearly, guiding the traders with patterns older than history. Around small fires, stories were told, quiet songs were sung, and the day's exhaustion was shared in silence. Camels knelt patiently, their loads finally removed, their breath steaming in the cold desert air. The salt blocks rested on the ground like pale monuments, waiting for the next day's journey. In such moments, one could almost forget the hardships, carried away by the vast stillness of the night. But the desert always reminded travelers of its power. Sandstorms could appear with little warning, walls of dust that rolled across the land, swallowing caravan and sky alike in a blur of motion. Men wrapped their veils tightly, camels turned their faces from the sting, and the caravan halted until the storm had passed. Sometimes days were lost in waiting, and supplies dwindled, but this was part of the rhythm of the road. To travel the Sahara was to accept its pace, its unpredictability, and its silence. The wealth of salt was balanced always against the risk of the journey. Yet people returned, again and again, generation after generation, because salt was not a luxury, but a necessity. It preserved meat, it flavored food, it sustained life. For many communities, the arrival of the salt caravan was as important as the arrival of water. The trade routes shaped not only the economies of kingdoms, but also the patterns of daily survival for countless villages. The salt roads remind us that history is often written not in sudden moments of conquest or invention, but in the patient persistence of ordinary needs. A block of salt, heavy and plain, carried across weeks of desert, held the power to connect distant worlds, to enrich cities, to sustain empires, and to remind us of the strange balance between fragility and endurance that defines human life. In the Sahara, the roads of salt were more than paths of commerce. They were lines of memory, carved across the dunes by countless footsteps, fading and reforming, enduring as quietly as the desert itself. To understand the salt roads is to understand the strange balance between geography and human determination. The Sahara stretches across nearly the entire width of northern Africa, covering an expanse so large that it is often compared to the size of the United States, or even larger. Yet despite its intimidating scale, people found ways to carve out paths across it, turning the harshest landscape into a corridor of trade. The caravans were not random wanderers. They followed routes that had been established over centuries, trails that connected salt mines in the north to the markets of the south. Each road had its own dangers, its own landmarks, and its own rhythm, and the traders who guided them treated this knowledge like treasure. They memorized the shapes of rocks, the slopes of dunes, the positions of stars at different times of year, all of which served as maps in a land where ink and paper would be useless. These salt roads shaped cities as much as they shaped the desert. Take the city of Gao, for example, once a capital of the Songhai Empire. Situated along the Niger River, it became a hub where goods from the north met goods from the south, and where salt, always salt, was exchanged for gold dust gathered from riverbeds far below the desert. Gao, Timbuktu, Walata, and other towns grew because caravans needed places to stop, to trade, to rest, and to resupply. The prosperity of these cities was not accidental. It was born from the rhythm of camels and the value of salt. Consider also the camels themselves, the true ships of the desert. Without them, the salt roads would not have existed. Their bodies were made for this environment. Wide padded feet that did not sink into sand, humps that stored fat for energy, the ability to go days without water, and nostrils that could close against blowing dust. They carried heavy loads without complaint, swaying gently as they moved, their pace slow but unbroken. For the traders, camels were companions as much as tools. Their survival tied to one another. A lost camel could mean a lost fortune, but more importantly, it could mean the difference between life and death. The journey was never taken lightly. The desert did not forgive mistakes. Water was life, and wells were lifelines. Each one was known, named, remembered. The distance between them had to be calculated with precision, for to misjudge the space between could spell disaster. Sometimes, entire caravans vanished, swallowed by storms or lost in the shifting sands. Stories of such losses were told for generations, reminders of the respect demanded by the desert. Yet despite the danger, the trade endured. The salt roads endured. Empires rose and fell, kings gained and lost power, yet caravans continued their patient march. In many ways, the salt roads were stronger than the empires they served. Gold might lose its luster, cities might crumble, but the need for salt remained constant. It is worth pausing to imagine what it felt like to reach the end of such a journey. After weeks of silence, of heat, of endless sand, the caravan would arrive at a bustling market town. Suddenly, sound and color replaced the monotony. Merchants shouted prices, buyers examined goods. The smell of spices and food filled the air. The salt blocks were unloaded, stacked like shining walls, and weighed against gold or traded for grain, cloth, or other necessities. For the desert traders, this was the reward, not only in wealth, but in the renewal of connection, the reminder that their efforts tied them into a larger world. The salt roads were arteries through which lifeblood flowed, carrying not only goods, but also culture, knowledge, and even faith. Islamic scholars traveled these routes, spreading learning and ideas as surely as merchants spread goods. Mosques were built in desert towns, libraries filled with manuscripts, and learning thrived in places that outsiders might have dismissed as barren. The desert, harsh and empty to some, was in truth a place of exchange and growth. Its silence hid the sound of footsteps that shaped history, footsteps that carried blocks of salt that were heavier than they appeared, for they bore with them the weight of civilization itself. When we think about the salt roads, we must remember that they were not only pathways for goods, but also for cultures, and in that way they functioned like invisible threads stitching together distant societies across Africa. The caravans that moved across the Sahara were more than merchants. They were bearers of languages, traditions, and ideas. As they passed from oasis to oasis, from settlement to settlement, they carried stories of kings and kingdoms, tales of markets bustling with trade, and even news of wars or peace treaties signed far away. In this way, the Sahara, though forbidding and immense, became a corridor of connection. The movement of salt was constant, but what it touched along its journey was far greater than any block of mineral. Consider the kingdom of Mali, which rose to prominence in the 13th and 14th centuries, flourishing in large part because of control over trade routes. Salt flowing southward met gold flowing northward, and the balance between the two created extraordinary wealth. Mansa Musa, the most famous of Mali's rulers, is remembered not only for his piety, but for his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca, during which he carried so much gold that its value reportedly fell in Cairo for years after. That wealth, glittering and immense, was tied directly to the steady arrival of salt caravans from the north. Salt gave strength to empires, because without it, food could not be preserved, armies could not be sustained, and markets could not flourish. Yet this history is not only about kings and merchants. At its heart, it is also about the countless ordinary people whose lives were shaped quietly by the salt trade. Villagers waited anxiously for the arrival of the caravan, knowing that its salt would keep their meat safe from spoilage, that it would allow their grain to last through lean seasons, and that it could be traded further for tools, cloth, or livestock. For them, the appearance of the first camels on the horizon was as much a moment of relief as it was of commerce. To the miners in the north, whose hands cracked and bled in the salt pits, these blocks were not symbols of wealth but burdens of survival. They carved the earth in the blazing sun, lifting heavy slabs that would never remain in their villages, for they were destined always to leave, always to travel. Life in the mines was hard, yet it sustained entire communities, and each generation handed the work down to the next. The salt roads were thus built not only on sand, but also on human endurance. Night after night, the desert itself seemed to watch silently as caravans passed. The stars above bore witness to centuries of movement, and the dunes, though shifting, remembered the weight of footsteps pressed into them again and again. The desert has no monuments in the way cities do, yet the salt roads were monuments of a different kind, invisible but enduring, carved not in stone but in memory. To imagine this is to see the Sahara, not as an empty wasteland, but as a stage upon which human history unfolded slowly, patiently, and with dignity. Traders endured thirst, heat, storms, and uncertainty. Yet they returned, guided by the understanding that salt was life, and that life itself demanded movement. Even today, traces of these routes survive, and though airplanes and highways may now cross Africa, the memory of the salt roads lingers. Camels still walk in parts of Mali and Niger, still carrying blocks of salt, still moving at the same patient pace as their ancestors did centuries ago. In their quiet persistence, they remind us that history is not only about change, but also about continuity. The salt roads are a lesson in patience, in endurance, and in the quiet strength of human communities who, faced with a desert that seemed determined to resist them, nevertheless carved a rhythm of life across it. The Sahara, vast and indifferent, could not erase these paths. Instead, it held them gently, allowing them to exist, to fade and reappear, to serve as a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, humanity will find a way to survive, to adapt, and to connect. As the salt caravans wound their way across the Sahara, they passed through landscapes that seemed timeless, yet each had its own character, its own challenges, and its own quiet beauty. The dunes, tall and shifting, were only one part of the desert. There were also stretches of rocky plateaus where the ground shimmered with heat, flat plains where the horizon stretched endlessly, and oases where green palms rose like small miracles from the sand. At these oases, life gathered. Wells dug deep into the earth brought water to the surface, and with it came vegetation, shade, and the possibility of rest. Caravans planned their journeys carefully to reach such places, for without them, the desert would be impassable. Imagine arriving after days of endless sand, the camels groaning under their loads, the traders weary, their lips dry. To see a line of palm trees waving gently in the distance must have felt like salvation. These stops were not only for water, but for exchange. Local people sold food, repaired equipment, and sometimes provided new camels or donkeys for the journey. In turn, they received salt or other goods, ensuring that even the smallest community played its part in the great chain of trade. The salt roads, then, were not just long highways. They were dotted with vital lifelines that turned the desert from an enemy into something survivable. Yet survival was never guaranteed. Heat stroke, dehydration, and exhaustion were constant dangers. Sandstorms could strip away all sense of direction, forcing caravans to huddle together and wait in suffocating darkness until the winds passed. Even the camels, sturdy as they were, could collapse from fatigue, and a fallen camel meant a block of salt lost, a load redistributed, a burden heavier for the rest. Traders faced these dangers with patience, because the rhythm of the salt roads allowed for no other choice. Haste was impossible, caution was essential. To travel across the Sahara was to surrender to its pace, and in that surrender came survival. Beyond the physical dangers, there was also the challenge of trust. Caravans relied on cooperation. Traders traveled together not only for safety, but also for the shared knowledge of routes and the shared burden of risk. A caravan broken by disputes or betrayal would not last. Thus, trust became as valuable as salt itself. Agreements were sealed not with ink, but with honor, and those who broke them found no place in future caravans. The desert demanded loyalty, for only loyalty could endure its silence. At night, when the fires burned low and the stars arched across the sky, traders might sit quietly, speaking in low tones or not at all, listening to the faint sounds of camels shifting or the soft wind brushing the sand. In those moments, one could sense the ancient continuity of their task. They were part of something larger than themselves, part of a chain stretching back to ancestors who had made the same journey, guided by the same stars, carrying the same precious salt. It is difficult for us today, in a world of airplanes and instant communication, to grasp the patience demanded by the salt roads. Journeys took weeks or months. Messages traveled no faster than the caravans that carried them. Life unfolded at a pace set by the desert itself, a pace that seemed unchanging, eternal. Yet within that slowness was a rhythm that shaped entire civilizations. The wealth of Mali, the scholarship of Timbuktu, the power of the Songhai Empire, all of these rested on the quiet persistence of men and camels crossing the dunes. Salt, so ordinary in our kitchens today, was once the foundation of empires, and it was carried by footsteps across sands that seemed to stretch forever. The salt roads remind us that history is not always made with noise or sudden events. Sometimes it is made in silence, in patience, in the endurance of countless unnamed travelers who walked steadily forward, guided only by necessity and hope. The Sahara still remembers them, though it speaks only in whispers carried by the wind. The salt roads of the Sahara were not only about the movement of goods, but also about the slow shaping of identities and traditions across centuries. For each caravan was a moving community, a small world of its own, bound by shared hardship and sustained by rituals that gave rhythm to the endless march. At the start of each day, the camels were loaded in silence, their heavy burdens lifted with practiced ease, ropes pulled tight, knots checked again and again. The men wrapped their veils against the coming heat, drank a last sip of water, and set out with the rising sun at their backs. The desert gave no mercy, but it also asked for no drama. Everything was steady, deliberate, calm, because one could not afford mistakes in such a land. The sound of the caravan was minimal, the crunch of sand under broad camel feet, the creak of wooden saddles, the occasional grunt of an animal shifting under its load. Conversation was sparse, for breath was precious and words traveled poorly in the dry air. Instead, communication happened through gestures, through the simple act of walking together, through the shared knowledge that each depended on the others. Nights brought a different world. As the fires flickered against the dark, traders took small comforts in routine. Some prepared simple meals of grain or dried meat, salted of course, while others checked the loads for the following day. Around the fire, stories might be exchanged, but often they were quiet stories, told slowly, with long pauses, blending into the silence of the desert itself. Songs were sung in low voices, songs that guided camels, soothed children, or simply filled the vast emptiness with a trace of humanity. It was in these moments that bonds were strengthened, and the caravan became more than just a line of men and animals. It became a family tied together by endurance. Beyond the physical journey, there was also a spiritual dimension to the salt roads. Many of the traders were Muslims, and the desert itself seemed to amplify the discipline of prayer. At dawn, at midday, at sunset, men knelt on mats spread upon the sand, their voices rising softly into the dry air, prayers carried toward the stars that would later guide them. The silence of the Sahara, immense and indifferent, seemed to magnify these acts of devotion, turning each prayer into a moment of connection that stretched beyond the desert, beyond the earth itself. In this way, the salt roads were also roads of faith. The desert shaped identity, giving birth to cultures that prized patience, honor, and memory. To survive in such a place required resilience, but it also required humility, the understanding that no man could conquer the Sahara, only live within its rhythm. This humility was carried back to the towns and cities that thrived because of the trade. Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenny became not only wealthy, but also wise. Their libraries filled with manuscripts, their scholars respected across the Islamic world. Salt paid for this wisdom, and the caravans that carried it brought with them not only mineral wealth, but also the slow accumulation of knowledge and learning. For centuries, this system endured with little change. Generations were born, lived, and died, and still the salt caravans passed, To the outside world, they might have seemed primitive or quaint, but to those who lived along the salt roads, they were as essential as rivers or seasons. The Sahara may have been a desert, but it was not barren. It was alive with memory, alive with the footsteps of countless travelers, alive with the quiet persistence of human life pushing steadily against the odds. To think of the salt roads is to think of continuity, of traditions repeated so many times that they became eternal. Even today, as modern highways and technology spread, echoes of those roads remain, carved not in stone, but in the habits of people, in the memory of towns, and in the quiet dignity of the desert itself. The salt roads, when seen through the long lens of history, reveal how something as ordinary as a block of mineral could become the foundation for entire patterns of life, trade, and culture. In our kitchens today, salt sits quietly on a table, used without thought. But in the centuries of the Sahara trade, salt was weight, power, and survival itself. To understand why, one must imagine life before refrigeration, before ships carried ice across oceans, before preservation could be managed by machines. In such a world, food spoiled quickly, and the only way to keep meat edible for more than a few days was with salt. Grain, too, needed salt to last through long storage, and fish caught far from market could only reach a city's table if packed in layers of it. Salt made it possible for communities to survive droughts, famines, and lean years, and so its value was constant, steady, and unquestionable. In some regions, it was measured against gold, in others it was paid as tax, and in many it became part of daily wages. Roman soldiers were sometimes given salt allowances, a practice that gave us the very word salary. Across the desert, salt functioned as a silent currency, blocks carried carefully, exchanged with solemnity, guarded with the same seriousness as gold coins or silver bars. To walk the salt roads was to walk inside this economy of survival, where each block meant meals for families, strength for armies, and wealth for rulers. The caravans themselves were symbols of patience. They did not rush, they did not change with the seasons of empire. They simply endured. Empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai rose and fell, but caravans continued. Their rhythm was older than kings, older than palaces, tied not to politics, but to the unchanging human need for salt. This endurance gave the Sahara a paradoxical role. Though it looked empty, it was one of the most important arteries of medieval trade. Towns that today seem isolated were once crossroads of the world, their names known to merchants in Cairo, Marrakesh, and even beyond. Timbuktu, for example, was not just a place of trade, but a place of learning, its scholars writing manuscripts on law, science, and philosophy, many of which survive in private collections today. All of this was made possible by the arrival of caravans bringing salt. The wealth generated by these journeys allowed rulers to build mosques, commission scholars, and attract travelers from across the Islamic world. In this way, the salt roads gave rise to a golden age, carried not on ships, but on the broad backs of camels. And yet, for all their importance, the journeys remained humble. There were no triumphal arches, no great celebrations. The traders walked under the sun, veils pulled across their faces, eyes narrowed against the glare. They followed the stars, checked the wells, and trusted the path laid down by generations before. Each journey was a repetition, a pattern carved into the sands, invisible to the outside world, but deeply familiar to those who lived within it. At night, as fires burned low, a strange thought might occur, that their footsteps were part of something eternal, that the sound of camels shifting in the sand was as ancient as time itself. In this way, the salt roads carried not only goods, but also a sense of continuity, a quiet reminder that history is often made not in sudden bursts of action, but in long, patient endurance. Even now, if one listens to the wind sweeping over the Sahara, one might imagine it carries echoes of those caravans, the creak of leather, the soft thud of feet, the quiet voices of men guiding their animals forward. The desert remembers, even if silently, and in its memory lies the story of the salt roads, a story as vast and unending as the sands themselves. To walk further into the story of the salt roads is to realize that these desert highways were not only about commerce, but about the meeting of worlds. For each caravan that crossed the Sahara was a bridge between the Mediterranean coast and the rich forests and rivers of West Africa, carrying with it not just salt, but the possibility of connection. From the north came salt, cloth, and sometimes horses. From the south came gold, kola nuts, ivory, and enslaved captives. The balance of these exchanges shaped entire centuries of history, feeding the wealth of empires and weaving together cultures that might otherwise have remained distant. The trade was slow, almost timeless, yet its impact was profound. Imagine the slow rhythm of camels arriving in Timbuktu, their loads of salt stacked high, each block glimmering in the sunlight. The markets buzzed with activity, merchants shouting, buyers examining, scribes keeping careful accounts. To the outsider, it might have seemed chaotic, but it was an order built upon repetition, upon generations of exchange that had refined every gesture into habit. Salt was carried in large rectangular slabs, heavy and solid, their surfaces sometimes marked by the tools that had cut them from the mines. These blocks were stacked in neat piles, weighed carefully, and then traded for dust-like grains of gold, measured with scales so small that even the faintest breath could tip them. The contrast was striking: heavy white blocks of salt against tiny, glittering specks of gold. Yet in value, they were equals. This balance became the lifeline of kingdoms. It is said that in the markets of Mali, salt was sometimes worth its weight in gold. And in a way, it was even more precious, for while gold could adorn and display power, salt was life itself. Armies could not march without it, food could not last without it, and communities could not endure without it. Thus, rulers who controlled the salt routes wielded real power, not only through wealth, but through necessity. The silent march of caravans across the Sahara fed the growth of empires, even when those empires did not see the desert with their own eyes. The desert was both harsh and generous, giving only to those who respected its rhythm. Every journey reinforced the same lessons: patience, endurance, cooperation, and humility. And so the salt roads were not only about what was carried, but about how it was carried. The rituals of the road shaped the character of those who walked it, teaching them to endure long silences, to trust companions, and to read the land with sensitivity. Knowledge of wells, of star paths, of the signs of storms became as valuable as the salt itself. To lose that knowledge was to lose life. Caravans were thus also moving schools, where younger men learned from elders, where every mile was a lesson passed down, and where the desert itself served as teacher. Night after night, as the fires flickered and stars stretched overhead, these lessons became part of memory, woven into songs and stories that ensured survival. In this way, the salt roads were also cultural roads, shaping traditions as surely as they carried goods. Today, when one imagines Timbuktu or Gao, it is easy to see them as remote, almost mythical places, but in their prime, they were vibrant centers, alive with the hum of scholarship, religion, and trade. Scholars copied manuscripts by hand, merchants counted coins, travelers from far-off lands marveled at the wealth and learning they found there. And beneath it all, supporting it all, was the simple block of salt carried patiently across the desert. Without it, the markets would have been empty, the schools silent, the cities poor. With it, they thrived, shining brightly in the memory of history. The salt roads remind us that greatness is sometimes built not on dramatic events, but on small, steady movements, repeated endlessly, quietly, and with purpose. They are a lesson in endurance, in patience, and in the way simple things can hold up entire worlds. As the centuries passed, the salt roads of the Sahara continued their quiet work, shaping not only trade, but also the very perception of the desert itself. To outsiders, the Sahara appeared as a barren void, a place of death and silence, but to those who walked it, the desert was alive with meaning, a canvas of roots and landmarks etched into memory. Every dune, every rock formation, every hidden well carried significance, and caravans moved as though guided by invisible threads connecting one memory to another. Knowledge of these paths was passed orally, from father to son, from elder to youth, in songs, in stories, and in whispered directions. A single miscalculation could mean disaster, so memory was both map and lifeline. In this way, the salt roads were fragile yet enduring, dependent on human recollection yet lasting across centuries. Along the routes, the desert towns became more than way stations. They became cultural crossroads. In places like Walada, traders rested in mud brick houses decorated with intricate patterns, while in Chingeti, libraries accumulated, filled with manuscripts carried by scholars and merchants. These towns, modest in size, became intellectual beacons, proof that even in the desert, knowledge could thrive. Salt funded these centers of learning, for wealth created leisure, and leisure created the possibility of scholarship. Thus, the simple act of carrying salt across sand ended up shaping philosophy, law, and science far beyond the Sahara itself. Travelers who visited these towns often described them with wonder, for they found not only markets, but also mosques, schools, and communities rooted in faith and learning. The desert, so empty to the eye, held within it a chain of civilizations linked by salt. Yet the roads were not without suffering. Workers in the salt mines of Taoudani endured brutal conditions, cutting the earth under a sun that burned relentlessly, their lives often short, their work endless. Slaves were forced into the mines, their labor feeding the caravans that enriched distant cities. This darker side of the salt trade reminds us that history is rarely simple, that wealth often rests upon hardship, unseen by those who benefit. For every library filled with manuscripts, there were men whose backs bent under the weight of slabs carved from the earth, men who never saw the wealth their labor created. The salt roads thus hold a dual legacy, one of connection and learning, but also one of suffering and endurance. Despite this, the roads endured because the need for salt endured. Gold might glitter, ivory might impress, but salt was never optional. It was the foundation of daily survival. And so the caravans returned, generation after generation, their pace steady, their path familiar. Even in times of war, the caravans often continued, for hunger and thirst cared little for politics. In this way, the salt roads were stronger than kingdoms, stronger than kings. They belonged to the desert, and the desert belonged to no one. The Sahara, with its silence and vastness, shaped human humility. No matter how wealthy or powerful a ruler might be, his empire depended on the quiet work of nameless men guiding camels across dunes. The salt roads whispered this truth, that human life is sustained not by grandeur, but by endurance, by patience, and by the willingness to walk steadily forward, even when the horizon never seems to change. To imagine those caravans today is to see lines of camels stretching into the distance, the sun low in the sky, the desert glowing gold, the blocks of salt stacked neatly, swaying with each step. There is no hurry, no drama, only the steady rhythm of survival. And in that rhythm lies the story of the Sahara, a story of silence, of necessity, and of endurance that has lasted longer than many empires, and will be remembered long after their names have faded into dust. To bring the story of the salt roads toward its quiet conclusion is to reflect on how something so ordinary could shape centuries of human life. For the caravans that crossed the Sahara were not grand armies, not fleets of ships, not monuments of stone, but simply long lines of camels, steady footsteps, and silent men carrying blocks of salt across endless sands. Yet in their patience lay a force as powerful as any empire, a force that sustained life, that enriched kingdoms, and that built connections across a continent. Salt was the invisible foundation beneath prosperity, its presence taken for granted, its absence catastrophic. The desert, vast and indifferent, became a stage upon which this quiet drama unfolded for hundreds of years, shaping kingdoms like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, shaping cities like Gao, Timbuktu, and Djenné, shaping countless villages that waited anxiously for the arrival of salt caravans. It is tempting to imagine the salt roads as romantic, but they were not. They were harsh, dangerous, exhausting. Workers in Taoudani cut slabs of salt in brutal heat. Traders endured thirst and fatigue. Camels staggered under heavy loads. Yet because salt was life, the roads never fell silent. Even when empires crumbled, even when wars raged, the caravans still moved, guided by memory, by stars, and by necessity. This continuity makes the salt roads one of history's quiet marvels, a system that endured not because of invention or technology, but because of sheer human persistence. Along these routes, culture also moved. Faith spread, manuscripts traveled, knowledge grew. Towns became centers of learning, not despite the desert, but because of it. Because salt created wealth, and wealth created leisure for scholars to write, to teach, to preserve wisdom. Thus, the salt roads remind us that history's treasures are not always carried in gold chests, but sometimes in plain slabs of mineral wrapped in rope and balanced on the back of a camel. Today, when one stands in the Sahara, the silence is immense. The dunes stretch endlessly, the sky presses down, the wind whispers without pause. It is difficult to imagine that once the silence was filled with the soft creak of saddles, the muffled rhythm of hooves, the low voices of men guiding caravans forward. Yet echoes remain. In some places, salt caravans still move, smaller, fewer, but still patient, still steady. Camels still sway under their burdens, men still wrap their veils against the sun, and slabs of salt still gleam white against the golden sand. They are living reminders of a history that refuses to vanish, a continuity that humbles the rush of modern life. For though airplanes now cross continents in hours, and technology has given us new ways to preserve food, the memory of the salt roads lingers, carried in songs, in stories, in the quiet dignity of the desert peoples who once gave their lives to this trade. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson of the salt roads, that endurance itself is a form of greatness, not the sudden blaze of conquest, not the loud cry of battle, but the slow, steady march of necessity across centuries. The Sahara, indifferent and immense, watched as generations passed, and in that silence, humanity carved a rhythm of survival. The salt roads endure in memory because they embody what it means to persist, to adapt, and to connect. As you drift now deeper into sleep, imagine the long line of camels stretching across the horizon, the desert glowing softly in the evening light, the stars above guiding the way. Hear the faint creak of leather, the soft thud of footsteps, the whisper of wind over sand. Feel the patience of centuries wrapping around you, steady and calm, reminding you that life, like the salt roads, is carried forward not in haste, but in quiet endurance. That is the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you will never miss a night of calm history. And now let us continue our Boring History for Sleep series with the next story, the dull growth of the Silk Road. The Silk Road, despite the romance the name conjures today, was never a single road, never a clear highway stretching from one empire to another. Instead, it was a collection of routes, trails, and paths that slowly formed over centuries. A network shaped not by grand design, but by necessity, by the steady pull of trade between East and West. Its growth was not sudden, nor was it dramatic. It unfolded in dull persistence, as merchants sought new markets, as villages slowly turned into towns, and as the needs of daily survival pushed people to exchange what they had for what they lacked. Imagine a caravan leaving a city in northern China, its camels and donkeys loaded with bolts of silk, lacquerware, and porcelain. These goods would not travel in a single dramatic arc to Rome or Constantinople, as stories sometimes suggest. Instead, they would pass through countless hands, traded for horses on the steppe, for spices in Central Asia, for glassware in Persia, and for wool in the lands closer to the Mediterranean. No single merchant made the entire journey. Instead, goods traveled like a whisper, moving slowly westward, changing ownership, gaining value, and connecting worlds that might otherwise have remained apart. The Silk Road grew not because rulers decreed it, but because human need persisted. Farmers had surpluses of grain, herders had horses, craftsmen had tools, miners had metal, and each wanted something the other could provide. At first, these exchanges were local, between neighbors, but slowly, through repetition and memory, these exchanges extended outward, one village to the next, one valley to another, until the outlines of trade stretched further than anyone might have imagined. Geography shaped the routes as much as desire. The Great Taklamakan Desert in western China forced caravans north or south along its edges, guiding them toward oasis towns like Kashgar and Dunhuang. The Pamir Mountains demanded careful passage through high valleys where snow lingered even in summer. Each barrier created a branching point, a place where travelers had to choose, and over time these choices formed the arteries of a vast, uneven network. Unlike modern highways, the Silk Road was not permanent. Routes shifted with wars, with climate, with the rise and fall of cities. A bandit raid might make one path unsafe. A generous ruler might encourage another. A dried-up well might close yet another. The dull growth of the Silk Road was precisely this. Not a dramatic creation, but an endless adjustment. A slow weaving together of possibilities across centuries. Towns along these routes grew dull but steady, fed by the trickle of caravans. A market here, an inn there, a small shrine by the roadside where travelers prayed for safety. Little by little, these outposts became essential links, places where merchants rested, repaired their loads, exchanged goods, and passed on news. The Silk Road was thus as much about communication as it was about commerce. Stories of distant rulers, rumors of battles, whispers of inventions all traveled alongside bolts of silk and jars of spices. The growth was not rapid, but in its slowness, it was enduring. Even when empires collapsed, when cities were abandoned, when wars broke out, the need for exchange remained, and so routes reformed, redirected, reshaped by circumstance. In this way, the Silk Road became less a line on a map and more a habit of humanity. The instinct to connect, to trade, to move goods and ideas across great distances, no matter how long it took. To imagine this dull growth is to imagine not a grand spectacle, but a quiet persistence, the steady plodding of animals along dusty paths, the murmured bargaining of merchants in crowded bazaars, the slow accumulation of connections that, over time, linked civilizations together. It was not fast, it was not dramatic, but it was enduring, and in that endurance lies the true story of the Silk Road. As the Silk Road extended its reach, it was not silk alone that moved along its paths, but a wide variety of goods that reflected the quiet persistence of daily life. Silk was prized in the West because of its softness, its shimmer, and its rarity. Yet the caravans carried much more than that. Spices from India and Southeast Asia, jade from Central Asia, glass from Rome, paper from China, and wool from the steppes all traveled in one direction or another, passing from hand to hand in a slow chain of exchange. There was no single moment when the Silk Road suddenly appeared. Instead, it grew like a river branching through the landscape, splitting and rejoining, shaped by geography and necessity. The dull growth of the Silk Road was seen most clearly in the oases. Towns like Dunhuang, Samarkand, and Kashgar thrived not because of dramatic events, but because they sat where water could be found, where travelers could rest, and where caravans could exchange goods and information. These places became small worlds unto themselves, filled with markets where one might see Persian glass beside Chinese silk, Indian spices beside Central Asian horses. Yet the bustle of these markets was rarely loud or chaotic. Rather, it was steady, persistent, a rhythm repeated day after day, generation after generation. Traders did not rush. The Silk Road could not be hurried. Animals needed rest, roads shifted with the weather, political climates changed, and so the movement of goods was slow, deliberate, and cautious. A merchant might never see beyond his section of the road. A man in China might sell his silk to a caravan master, who would carry it only as far as Samarkand. There it would pass to another, who might take it to Persia, and so on. By the time the cloth reached the Mediterranean, no one could say how many hands had touched it, how many months or years had passed. This was the dull growth of trade, a patience that built connections across continents without haste, without spectacle. Geography imposed its own discipline. The deserts of Central Asia, the mountains of the Pamirs, the wide steppes where nomads roamed, each posed challenges that slowed the pace. A sandstorm could delay a caravan for days. A snowstorm could trap travelers in high passes. A dried-up well could force a detour of hundreds of miles. These obstacles did not end the Silk Road, they shaped it. The routes bent, twisted, and adapted, but they never disappeared entirely. The Silk Road was not one fixed road, but a shifting web, always adjusting, always growing, never truly still. And within this slowness, ideas moved as surely as goods. Buddhism spread from India into China along these routes, carried not by armies, but by monks who traveled with caravans, stopping at towns and temples, sharing stories and teachings. Later, Islam would spread along the same paths, its traders building mosques in oasis towns, its scholars carrying books and learning. Even Christianity made its quiet way eastward, its presence faint but real. The Silk Road was not only about what was traded, but about what was shared. And this sharing was never sudden, but always gradual, as if the desert itself demanded that ideas, like goods, must move slowly. To picture the dull growth of the Silk Road is to see not battles and empires, but caravans in twilight, camels swaying under their loads, merchants speaking in low voices, stars emerging in the wide sky above. It is to imagine markets where language is mixed, where gestures replaced words, where trust had to be built carefully, slowly, over time. The Silk Road grew because people returned again and again, because the need for exchange was constant, because no empire, no desert, no mountain could erase that need. In its slowness, the Silk Road achieved something remarkable. It connected worlds without ever intending to, simply by repeating the same patterns, step after step, mile after mile, century after century. The Silk Road in its early centuries was less a grand vision and more an accumulation of habits, a repetition of steps and exchanges that gradually created a network of connections stretching farther than anyone could have planned. When we imagine this growth, it is best not to picture maps drawn with neat lines, but instead to imagine countless small interactions. A farmer selling surplus grain at a market, a herder trading horses for cloth, a craftsman offering his tools to passing travelers. Each of these exchanges was ordinary, even dull, but together they created pathways that stretched across deserts, mountains, and valleys. The dull growth of the Silk Road can be seen in the slow rise of towns that became stopping points. Places like Merv, Bukhara, and Turpan were not founded as great capitals, but they became important because caravans needed places to rest, to water their animals, and to repair their loads. Slowly, these towns accumulated wealth, their streets filling with bazaars, their houses decorated with goods from distant lands. A merchant in Turpan might own a Roman glass vessel, a sign of a connection so distant that it would have seemed almost mythical, and yet it arrived not by miracle, but by the slow persistence of trade. For the travelers, the Silk Road was not a single journey, but a series of stages. No one attempted to cross the entire continent. Instead, goods were handed off like a baton in a relay race, passing through many hands. This was practical, for distances were vast, dangers real, and political boundaries shifting. The road was not smooth. It was broken, interrupted, redirected, and yet always reformed. Caravans moved slowly, camels swaying under heavy loads, traders speaking in dozens of languages, each carrying with them not only goods, but also fragments of culture, fragments of stories, fragments of ideas. Geography forced its rhythm on all of this. The Taklamakan Desert in Xinjiang offered no forgiveness, so caravans skirted its edges, clinging to the life of oasis towns. The high mountains of the Pamirs and the Hindu Kush required careful passage, where a single mistake could cost lives. The steppes were wide and open, but also vulnerable to raids by nomads, whose power could shift the routes of trade overnight. Yet even with all these obstacles, the road did not disappear. It endured because the need for exchange endured. Silk was precious in the Roman world, not only because of its rarity, but because it represented the distant and the exotic. In turn, China valued horses from the steppe, strong animals essential for defense and war. This mutual need, repeated endlessly, created bonds that were never broken, even when empires fell. The dull growth of the Silk Road is also seen in the spread of ideas. Buddhism, carried by monks and travelers, slowly moved along these paths, establishing temples and monasteries in oasis towns. These temples became places of rest, not only for monks but also for merchants, for trade and religion often intertwined. Centuries later, Islam would travel these same routes, its merchants building mosques, its scholars teaching in the bazaars, its culture blending with local traditions. Nothing happened quickly, but over time, the landscape itself began to change, marked by shrines, libraries, and schools funded by trade. To imagine the Silk Road in this way is to hear the dull rhythm of footsteps, the creak of saddles, the murmur of bargaining in crowded markets. It is to see the slow accumulation of wealth, not in sudden bursts, but in layers built carefully, one trade at a time. The Silk Road was not glamorous in its daily reality. It was dusty, difficult, dangerous, but in its dullness lay its strength. Its growth was patient, its endurance remarkable, and its legacy immense, connecting worlds that might otherwise never have known each other. The dull growth of the Silk Road is best understood not as a single event, or even as a single network, but as a process that unfolded slowly, shaped by geography, climate, politics, and the persistence of human need. In the beginning, small local exchanges connected neighboring valleys, but with each generation, these exchanges stretched farther outward. What began as a farmer selling his surplus grain to a nearby herder eventually became the foundation of a system that linked China to the Mediterranean. Yet the growth was never glamorous. Caravans trudged along at a pace dictated by the animals that carried the loads. Camels and donkeys moved slowly, their swaying steps repeating mile after mile, day after day. Merchants spoke in low tones, their voices lost in the wind of deserts or muffled by the snow of mountain passes. There were no dramatic triumphs, no sudden discoveries, only the steady persistence of travel, trade, and repetition. The desert itself forced caution. The Taklamakan was called the Desert of Death, for its shifting sands could swallow a caravan whole. Travelers avoided its heart, circling its edges, clinging to the lifelines of oases such as Khotan, Yarkand, and Kashgar. Each oasis town became a vital link in the chain, not only because of its water, but because it offered safety, markets, and rest. These towns grew slowly, their walls built with mud brick, their bazaars filled with goods that had traveled farther than their citizens could ever imagine. In Samarkand, one might find silk from China, lying beside Roman glass, Indian spices sold next to Persian carpets. The dull growth of trade brought such wonders together, but for the merchants it was routine. Goods were weighed, bargained, exchanged, and carried onward. To them it was not exotic but everyday life. Geography gave rhythm to the Silk Road. High mountains slowed caravans to a crawl, snow forcing long waits. Deserts demanded night travel when the air was cooler and the stars could guide the way. Steppes offered wide open land, but left caravans vulnerable to raids. In every region the road adapted, splitting into branches when necessary, rejoining when possible. Routes changed as rivers shifted course, as political powers rose and fell, as new centers of trade appeared while others declined. The dullness of this constant adjustment was its strength. The Silk Road survived not because it was fixed, but because it was flexible. Alongside goods moved ideas, though always at the same slow pace. Buddhism spread into China not by sudden conversion, but by centuries of monks traveling with caravans, teaching in small temples built at crossroads. Islam later followed the same routes, carried by merchants who prayed in makeshift mosques at oases. Even Christianity, faint but present, moved eastward with travelers and missionaries. None of this happened quickly. Instead, like the road itself, it grew in dull persistence, one conversation, one translation, one prayer at a time. And so the Silk Road was not only about what was carried in bales and boxes, but also about what was carried in memory, in story, in belief. Every caravan carried with it not just silk or spice, but fragments of culture that would be left behind in distant towns, where they blended with local traditions and slowly reshaped the character of whole regions. To imagine this is to picture the quiet rhythm of the road itself, the slow crunch of hooves on sand, the creak of leather straps, the murmured bargaining in a marketplace at dusk, the glow of firelight in an oasis town. There was no spectacle, no sudden moment of creation, only the dull, steady growth of connections that endured for centuries. And perhaps this is why the Silk Road still captures our imagination, not because of sudden drama, but because of the way it quietly stitched together distant worlds with nothing more than persistence, patience, and the simple need to exchange. The dull growth of the Silk Road was also marked by the quiet endurance of the people who traveled it, men and women whose lives were shaped entirely by the rhythm of trade. For caravan leaders, each journey was not a grand adventure, but a routine of preparation, patience, and survival. Before setting out, merchants gathered supplies: water skins, dried food, spare sandals, cloth to wrap against the sun, and tools for repairing saddles or carts. Camels were carefully chosen, not only for their strength, but for their steadiness, for an animal prone to panic could endanger an entire caravan. Once on the road, every step became part of a slow choreography, repeated endlessly until the next town or oasis. The growth of the Silk Road was never swift, because the very conditions of travel resisted haste. Dust storms rose suddenly in the deserts of Central Asia, forcing caravans to halt and wait in suffocating clouds of sand. Snow in the Pamirs blocked narrow passes, holding merchants for weeks until the thaw. Even in the open steppe, danger came not from nature, but from men, as nomadic raiders demanded tribute or attacked travelers outright. Each of these challenges slowed trade, but none could stop it, for the desire for goods, the need for exchange, always pressed forward again. Towns along the road grew in dull increments, each year adding a few more houses, a larger market square, another shrine or temple. In places like Dunhuang, caves were carved into cliffs, painted with Buddhist images brought by monks who traveled with the caravans. In Samarkand, bazaars expanded as more merchants stopped to rest. These changes were gradual, barely noticeable in a lifetime, but over centuries, they transformed small outposts into thriving centers of culture and learning. The dull growth of the Silk Road was therefore also the growth of these towns, each one shaped by the steady arrival of traders and the slow layering of cultures. Goods moved at the pace of animals, but ideas moved just as steadily. Paper, invented in China, spread along the road not in a single dramatic leap, but in gradual adoption. By the time it reached the Islamic world, it had already passed through countless hands. There, scholars embraced it, copying manuscripts with greater ease, building libraries that stored knowledge for future generations. The Silk Road did not make this happen quickly, but it made it inevitable. For once an idea was carried onto the road, it would eventually find its way elsewhere. The dullness of the road concealed its power, for its slow persistence changed civilizations in ways that sudden events could not. Consider also the lives of those who never traveled, but who depended on the road all the same. Farmers in distant valleys grew crops that would be traded far away, though they never saw where their goods ended up. Craftsmen in cities produced tools, jewelry, or textiles that might be carried across deserts they never entered. Even rulers, sitting in palaces, relied on the dull rhythm of caravans to bring them wealth, luxury, and knowledge. The Silk Road tied them all together, often invisibly, through trade so steady that it became part of the background of life. To imagine this road is to imagine patience itself. Caravans trudging in silence, markets opening and closing with little fanfare, goods changing hands countless times until no one remembered their origin. And yet, in this dull persistence lay a force stronger than war or empire. The Silk Road endured not because of drama, but because of necessity, not because of glory, but because of need. It grew because people always needed what others could provide. And so they walked, traded, and returned, century after century. The Silk Road, in all its length and quiet endurance, was not a road of heroes or sudden discoveries, but of repetition, routine, and slow transformation. Its growth was dull because it was constant, a steady current of exchange that flowed regardless of who ruled, regardless of wars, regardless of storms. Each caravan was not a spectacle but a rhythm, camels swaying under heavy loads, merchants speaking in low voices, guards scanning the horizon, and animals resting by dusty wells. What made the Silk Road grow was not speed but persistence. Empires rose and fell along its length. The Han Dynasty opened early connections to Central Asia, but even when it weakened, trade did not vanish. The Roman Empire prized silk, yet when Rome collapsed, demand simply shifted elsewhere. Later, Byzantine traders sought the same goods, and still the caravans trudged on. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad flourished, and goods flowed east and west. The Mongols came, creating a vast empire, and under their rule, the Silk Road reached one of its peaks, not through sudden innovation, but through the simple, dull act of ensuring safety, which allowed caravans to travel more freely. Each of these phases was less about dramatic change and more about continuity, the slow expansion of networks that already existed. Towns along the road bore witness to this slow growth. In Bukhara, scholars debated law and religion while merchants sold fabrics from distant lands. In Kashgar, the markets buzzed with exchange, not in bursts of drama, but in daily routine. As bolts of silk were weighed, coins counted, spices measured. In Merv, one could find travelers from India, Persia, China, and the Mediterranean, all mingling in a setting that was more ordinary than extraordinary. To those who lived there, the presence of foreign goods and faces was not exotic but normal, for the road's dull growth had woven it into the fabric of their lives. The challenges of travel remained the same. Deserts tested patience, mountains demanded caution, and political unrest forced rerouting. Yet these difficulties did not end the Silk Road. They merely redirected it, like a river finding new channels. Merchants learned to adapt, to wait, to seek alternate paths, and in doing so, they reinforced the dull but unstoppable nature of trade. Goods traveled more slowly than we can imagine today. A bolt of silk leaving China might take years to reach the Mediterranean, changing hands many times along the way. Each transfer added a small increase in price, a new story of origin, and a new meaning. By the time it reached a Roman noble or a Byzantine court, the silk was far removed from the Chinese loom that had woven it, yet it carried with it the weight of the road, the countless steps and countless exchanges that had delivered it. The dull growth of the Silk Road also spread knowledge. Paper, gunpowder, and printing slowly moved westward, while glassmaking, astrology, and medicine moved eastward. None of this was quick. It was slow, almost invisible, but steady. A scholar in Baghdad learned of Chinese paper not through conquest, but through trade. A monk in Dunhuang copied Buddhist sutras on paper that had once been rare, but now traveled more easily thanks to the road. These changes did not happen overnight. They unfolded over generations, like the slow growth of trees. And so the Silk Road reminds us that history is not only made in sudden bursts, but also in long silences, in dull persistence, in the patience of men and animals walking across landscapes that seemed endless. To think of it is to imagine twilight on the road, caravans moving steadily, the air cooling, stars beginning to appear, merchants resting in quiet, and the road itself stretching ahead, unchanged, patient, eternal. The slow and steady growth of the Silk Road can also be seen in the way it shaped cultures along its length, not through dramatic transformation but through gradual blending, a quiet exchange of habits, foods, beliefs, and ideas. In oasis towns, one could see this blending most clearly. In Kashgar, at the far western edge of China, markets brought together Central Asian horsemen, Persian traders, and Chinese merchants, each speaking in different tongues, yet through gestures, bargaining, and repetition, they created a shared language of trade. In Samarkand, stalls offered goods from every direction, their origins distant and often unknown. For what mattered was not where something came from, but what it could be exchanged for. Spices from India added flavor to meals in Central Asia, while Persian silverware found its way into Chinese households. This dull growth of exchange was not sudden, but over centuries it transformed diets, fashions, and daily life in ways that no single moment could explain. Religion moved in the same quiet way. Buddhism spread from India along the Silk Road not because of conquest, but because of persistence. Monks traveled with caravans, stopping at inns and temples, teaching and reciting sutras, leaving behind texts and statues. Over centuries, Buddhist cave temples at Dunhuang and other places became repositories of art and faith, funded by traders who sought merit and protection for their journeys. Later, Islam spread along the same routes, carried by merchants whose prayers at oases slowly planted mosques across Central Asia. These changes were not forced. They grew slowly, with each new generation adopting what felt useful, blending it with what was already familiar. The Silk Road was thus not only a trade network, but a cultural highway, yet one that moved at the same pace as its caravans, slowly, steadily, without spectacle. Political powers noticed this dull growth and often sought to control it, but even empires discovered that the road could not be commanded fully. The Han Dynasty sent envoys westward to secure horses. The Tang Dynasty encouraged trade, but could not eliminate bandits. The Byzantine Empire sought silk, but never truly controlled its source. Even the Mongols, whose empire stretched across much of Eurasia, did not create the road so much as stabilize it temporarily, allowing the caravans to move with fewer interruptions. Each attempt at control was fleeting compared to the endurance of the road itself. Goods and ideas flowed not because of rulers, but because of the needs of ordinary people. And that is why the Silk Road endured for centuries, long after dynasties collapsed. To imagine the dull growth of the Silk Road is to imagine countless small scenes: a merchant counting coins in a bazaar, a monk copying texts by the light of an oil lamp, a family in an oasis town, cooking with spices brought from afar, a craftsman in Persia shaping glass that would one day be sold in China. None of these moments are dramatic on their own. Yet together they created one of the most significant networks in history. It grew not through grand design, but through the persistence of routine, of ordinary lives repeated across generations. The Silk Road was not fast, it was not easy, and it was rarely glamorous, but in its slow, dull growth it connected worlds that would otherwise have remained apart, weaving together a fabric of exchange that lasted for more than 1,000 years. The dull growth of the Silk Road was not only about the exchange of goods and beliefs, but also about the way it quietly shaped the rhythms of daily life for those who lived along it. In villages and towns scattered across Central Asia, the arrival of a caravan was both expected and uneventful, for it was part of the cycle of life. Merchants unloaded their camels, rested in inns, bartered in markets, and then moved on. There were no parades, no celebrations, only the continuation of what had been happening for generations. For the local people, this was normal, the background of their existence. Children grew up seeing foreign traders speaking unfamiliar languages. Wives prepared meals with spices that had traveled thousands of miles. Artisans shaped objects influenced by styles from distant lands. Yet none of this felt exotic in the moment. It was simply the dull accumulation of change, gradual and steady, so slow that no single generation noticed its magnitude. The road also shaped professions. Entire families made their living as innkeepers, animal handlers, translators, or guides. Some specialized in repairing saddles or carts, others in producing food that could withstand long journeys. These trades were not glamorous, but they were essential, and they endured century after century. The Silk Road thus supported not only the movement of luxury goods, but also the quiet livelihoods of thousands who never traveled far from home, but whose lives depended on the steady trickle of caravans. Geography, as always, enforced its slow pace. Deserts demanded careful planning, forcing merchants to ration water and food. Mountains limited how much could be carried, making every load precious. Rivers and valleys served as lifelines, guiding the paths of traders, yet also forcing detours when floods or droughts struck. The Silk Road was never one road but many, shifting constantly in response to the land. This constant adaptation explains why it grew so steadily yet so slowly, for no map could capture it permanently, and no empire could hold it completely. Even in its dullness, the Silk Road was fragile. Bandits haunted certain stretches, forcing caravans to hire guards or travel in larger groups. Taxes were imposed by rulers along the way, each seeking a share of the wealth. At times, wars cut off entire sections, forcing trade to shift elsewhere. Yet trade always returned, for silk was too valuable, spices too essential, and connections too deeply rooted to vanish. The dull growth of the road was precisely this resilience. Even when interrupted, it reformed, bending around obstacles, flowing like water through whatever channels were available. The cultural exchanges that followed were rarely immediate but unfolded over centuries. Techniques in weaving, glassmaking, and metallurgy spread gradually, with craftsmen learning from travelers, experimenting slowly, and passing new methods to apprentices. Even foods made their way along the Silk Road in this way. Grapes traveled eastward, while peaches moved westward, each adopted quietly until they became naturalized in new lands. No one could say exactly when these shifts happened, because they were too slow, too ordinary, too dull to notice at the time. Yet centuries later, they reveal themselves as profound. To picture the Silk Road at dusk is to see a line of camels plodding steadily, merchants murmuring in different tongues, and the glow of small fires rising from an oasis town. There is no drama, only the dull repetition of survival, of trade, of connection. And yet within this dullness was a force that changed the world, linking distant civilizations not by conquest but by patience. The dull growth of the Silk Road reminds us that history is not always about sudden events, but often about the quiet persistence of ordinary people, whose steady steps across deserts and mountains slowly wove together a fabric of exchange that endures in memory even today. The long endurance of the Silk Road was not the result of any sudden invention or dramatic conquest, but the product of countless small choices repeated over centuries. A merchant choosing to risk the desert for profit, a farmer selling surplus grain to a passing caravan, a craftsman trading tools for spices. These simple acts built upon one another until they formed an invisible chain, stretching from China to the Mediterranean. The dull growth of the Silk Road is precisely this, a history without spectacle, where continuity mattered more than change. Every town along the route became accustomed to the slow rhythm of caravans. Inns opened not with ceremony but with routine, their courtyards filled with camels resting under the shade of mud brick walls. Markets bustled not in bursts of excitement, but with steady negotiation, the weighing of goods, the counting of coins, the murmurs of voices in many tongues. Over time, these sounds became the heartbeat of life in places like Bukhara, Merv, and Kashgar. Children grew up hearing them, and for them, the presence of foreign traders was nothing unusual. The Silk Road was not extraordinary for those who lived upon it. It was simply part of daily life. And yet this ordinariness was its strength. The dull growth of the road made it stable, made it enduring, made it able to survive the collapse of empires and the violence of wars. When one section was blocked by conflict, trade shifted elsewhere, bending like water around stones. When one city declined, another rose quietly to take its place. The Silk Road never truly ended, it only changed paths. Geography reinforced this persistence. Deserts like the Taklamakan or the Gobi could not be conquered quickly, so caravans learned patience, moving slowly, traveling by night, and relying on memory to find hidden wells. Mountains like the Pamirs could not be rushed, so traders crossed passes carefully, waiting out storms, moving only when safe. The land itself forced the road to grow slowly, and in doing so, it shaped the character of those who traveled it. They became patient, cautious, deliberate, qualities necessary for survival, but also qualities that made the Silk Road a channel of stability. Alongside goods moved stories and beliefs, and these too spread in the same dull, persistent way. Buddhism did not conquer China in a single moment, but arrived gradually, through statues carried by monks, through texts copied by hand, through temples built by merchants seeking protection. Islam too spread in this quiet way. Merchants praying at oases, mosques rising in caravan towns, faith carried not by armies but by trade. Even languages absorbed words from one another, adopting terms for goods, for weights, for tools. These changes were not immediate. They took centuries to root themselves, unnoticed in the moment, but clear in hindsight. The dull growth of the Silk Road was therefore also the dull growth of cultures, blending slowly, quietly, until new traditions emerged. To imagine the road in its ordinary reality is to see not excitement but patience. Caravans trudging through dust, merchants haggling over a measure of spice, monks copying sutras by lamplight, scribes recording trades on parchment, families cooking meals with ingredients from far away, yet already familiar. The road was never glamorous for those who walked it. It was hard work, it was danger, it was routine. But in its dullness, it achieved what few grand armies ever did. It lasted. The Silk Road's true legacy lies not in spectacle, but in persistence, in the way it connected distant worlds quietly, steadily, step by step, trade by trade, century by century. As the long story of the Silk Road reaches its quiet conclusion, it becomes clear that its legacy was not built on sudden triumphs or dramatic events, but on the slow, dull growth of centuries of repetition. Caravans set out, moved across deserts and mountains, reached towns, traded their goods, and returned home. The same pattern repeated again and again, generation after generation, until it became as natural as the rising and setting of the sun. This is why the Silk Road endured for more than 1,000 years. It was not the creation of one empire or one ruler, but the product of countless ordinary people, each of whom contributed their small part to a vast, unbroken chain. The road's dullness was also its resilience. Empires rose and fell, the Han, the Tang, the Abbasid, the Byzantine, the Mongol, but the caravans kept moving. Wars interrupted routes, bandits stole goods, deserts swallowed travelers. Yet trade always resumed. The need for silk in the west, the need for horses in the east, the hunger for spices, metals, glass, and paper. These simple needs were stronger than the disruptions of politics. The Silk Road survived because it answered enduring human desires, and desires do not vanish with dynasties. The dull growth of the Silk Road also created connections that reached beyond trade. In its slow and steady way, it carried ideas that reshaped cultures. Paper traveled from China to the Middle East, where it transformed scholarship, allowing books to multiply and libraries to grow. Buddhism spread eastward, Islam spread westward, and Christianity too left faint marks along the road. Techniques in glassmaking, weaving, and agriculture passed quietly from one region to another. Even food moved. Grapes and pomegranates found new homes in the east, while peaches and apricots spread to the west. None of this happened suddenly. It happened in the same slow rhythm as the caravans themselves, unnoticed in the moment, but powerful in the long view of history. To imagine the road at its end is to see the same ordinary scenes that defined it throughout its life. a caravan leader tightening ropes at dawn, camels swaying under their burdens, merchants murmuring in markets, scribes writing contracts, monks chanting prayers, children watching foreign traders pass through their towns. Nothing about these scenes was dramatic. They were dull, repetitive, everyday, and yet in their repetition, they built one of the most important networks in human history. The Silk Road eventually declined, not with a crash, but with the same quiet persistence that had defined it. New sea routes opened in the 15th and 16th centuries, allowing goods to move faster and in greater quantity by ship. Slowly, the caravans dwindled, the markets emptied, and the towns that had thrived on trade shrank into shadows of their former selves. But even in decline, the road never truly vanished. Memories of it lingered in stories, in manuscripts, in ruins that still stand in deserts and mountains. In some places, caravans still moved, small and local, carrying goods between towns, echoing the patterns of the past. The dull growth of the Silk Road lives on, not in bustling trade, but in the quiet memory of humanity's instinct to connect. And so, the Silk Road's story ends much as it began. Not with noise or spectacle, but with silence, with patience, with endurance. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine once more the endless line of camels crossing the horizon, the desert glowing under fading light, the stars emerging to guide the travelers forward. The Silk Road stretches out before them, not dramatic, not fast, but steady, dull, and eternal. A reminder that some of the greatest forces in history move not with speed, but with persistence. That is the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you will always have a calm place to return to each night. And now, let us continue our Boring History for Sleep series with the next story. The boring history of Roman taxes. When we think of the Roman Empire, we often imagine emperors in golden robes, gladiators fighting in grand arenas, or legions marching across distant frontiers. Yet beneath the splendor and drama of Roman history lay something far more ordinary, something far more persistent, and something that shaped the daily lives of millions of people: taxes. The story of Roman taxes is not filled with excitement or sudden events, but with dull routines, careful records, and the slow machinery of administration. It is in these details, in the quiet hum of bureaucracy, that the empire truly sustained itself for centuries. Taxes in Rome were not an invention of the emperors, but a continuation of earlier practices. Even in the days of the Republic, Roman citizens were expected to contribute to the state. At first, these taxes were irregular, demanded in times of war, when the treasury needed funds to pay soldiers or build ships. Citizens were assessed according to their property, a census was taken, and contributions were collected. Over time, however, as Rome expanded and its needs grew, taxation became more structured, more routine, and more inescapable. By the time of Augustus, the first emperor, taxes had become the backbone of imperial finance. The empire was vast, stretching from Britain to Egypt, and it needed constant resources to maintain its legions, build its roads, and supply its cities. Taxes provided these resources, not in sudden bursts, but in steady streams, year after year. The dull growth of Roman taxes lay in the way they reached into every corner of the empire. There were land taxes, collected from farmers who worked the soil. There were poll taxes, paid by individuals simply for existing under Roman rule. There were customs duties, charged at ports and city gates, where goods were weighed and measured before being allowed to pass. Even the simplest exchange, the sale of grain in a local market, might be subject to a small tax, a fraction of value taken quietly but consistently. The Romans also developed indirect taxes. These included sales taxes, inheritance taxes, and taxes on slaves. Each was small, but together they added up, flowing into the treasury in a steady trickle. To administer this system, Rome relied on officials and records. Census takers traveled from town to town, recording names, ages, property, and occupations. Tax collectors kept ledgers filled with numbers, columns of figures carefully written by hand. Most of this work was dull, repetitive, and unseen, but it was essential. Without it, the empire could not have paid its soldiers, supplied its provinces, or built the great aqueducts and roads that still survive today. For the ordinary Roman, taxes were a fact of life. Farmers handed over a portion of their harvest, merchants paid duties at city gates, families paid fees on inheritances. Even in death, the empire found ways to collect. People complained, as they always do, about taxes, but they also accepted them, for taxes were tied to the order and stability that Rome promised. The dull machinery of taxation gave Rome its durability. While battles were won and lost, while emperors rose and fell, the tax system remained, quietly feeding the empire's needs. Its growth was not dramatic, but it was steady, expanding as the empire expanded, adjusting as new provinces were added, and adapting to the needs of each generation. And so, the boring history of Roman taxes is not about sudden moments, but about continuity, about the way small amounts, collected patiently and persistently, built an empire that endured for centuries. To imagine it is to picture not the roar of a crowd in the Colosseum, but the quiet scratching of a scribe's pen across parchment, recording payments, adding sums, maintaining order. It is to imagine farmers carrying sacks of grain to a storehouse, merchants handing over coins at a toll gate, officials counting and recounting, all part of a system that was invisible yet indispensable. The Roman Empire's greatness rested not only on its legions and monuments, but also on its taxes, steady, dull, and enduring. The Roman tax system, though dull in its daily operation, was remarkable in its complexity and persistence, reaching into every province of the empire and touching nearly every aspect of life. One of the key features of the system was the land tax, known as the tributum soli, which was assessed on agricultural land. Farmers were required to hand over a portion of their harvest or its equivalent in money. This tax was crucial because agriculture was the foundation of the Roman economy, and grain in particular was needed not only to feed the armies, but also to supply the massive population of Rome itself. The process of collection was routine, slow, and carefully managed. Officials visited farms, estimated yields, and calculated the share owed. Records were kept, disputes settled, and payments made either in kind or in coin. Nothing about this was dramatic, but it was essential. Alongside the land tax, there was also the poll tax, or tributum capitis, levied on individuals, especially in provinces where Rome exerted control over conquered peoples. This was not popular, as it was a direct reminder of subjection to Roman authority, but it provided a reliable stream of income. In some places, it was assessed as a flat fee, in others scaled according to property and occupation. Once again, scribes and clerks recorded names, counted heads, and kept ledgers. These ledgers, filled with neat columns of figures, were perhaps the truest monuments of Rome's endurance, for they ensured that money flowed consistently into the imperial treasury. Another important aspect of the Roman tax system was customs duties, known as portoria. These were charged on goods transported across provincial boundaries, collected at gates, ports, and bridges. Merchants moving their wares encountered officials who weighed, measured, and valued goods before allowing them to pass. Whether it was a shipment of olive oil, amphorae of wine, or bolts of cloth, each transaction was slowed by the careful process of taxation. This may have been frustrating for traders, but it was another way the empire maintained control over commerce and ensured that wealth reached the state. Rome also introduced taxes on more specific activities. There was the vicesima hereditatium, a 5% inheritance tax, designed to bring in revenue from the transfer of wealth between generations. There was the sales tax, a small percentage taken from everyday transactions. Even slaves, considered property under Roman law, were taxed when sold. Each of these taxes was minor in isolation, but together they created a web of contributions that supported the empire's needs. The dull growth of the system was in its ability to expand and adapt. As new provinces were added to the empire, new tax arrangements were created. Local customs were sometimes retained, but always modified to ensure Roman control. In Egypt, for example, a province of immense wealth, taxes were collected in grain and shipped directly to Rome, feeding the population of the capital. In other provinces, taxes were paid in coin, which was then used to fund legions stationed along the frontiers. Each region contributed in its own way, but all were tied into the larger machinery of Roman finance. For the ordinary citizen, taxes were unavoidable. They might be hidden in the price of goods, demanded at the city gate, or recorded in the census. Complaints were common, for no one enjoys paying taxes, but the Romans largely accepted them because they understood that taxes were the price of peace, stability, and infrastructure. Roads, aqueducts, and public buildings were visible signs of what taxes provided, even if the connection between payment and benefit was not always clear. The boring history of Roman taxes is therefore not about dramatic rebellions or sudden reforms, but about slow continuity. Day after day, scribes added figures to parchment, officials counted sacks of grain, and collectors recorded payments. Each action was dull, each routine ordinary, yet together they sustained an empire of extraordinary scale. The daily machinery of Roman taxation was not carried out by emperors or senators, but by a wide network of officials, scribes, and collectors, whose names rarely appear in history, but whose steady work made the empire function. At the heart of this system was the census, a survey of population and property that determined how much each individual or community owed. Every 5 years in the Republic, and later at varying intervals under the emperors, Roman citizens were required to appear before magistrates, declare their property, and accept the tax burden assigned to them. The census was not glamorous. It was a bureaucratic ritual of counting, listing, and recording. People stood in lines, names were written on tablets, and property was described in detail. It was tedious, repetitive, and dull, but it provided the state with the information it needed to sustain itself. In the provinces, taxation often took the form of tribute, extracted from conquered peoples as both a financial resource and a reminder of subjugation. Governors oversaw collection, but the actual work was often contracted to private individuals known as publicani. These tax farmers bid for the right to collect taxes in a given region, paying the state an agreed amount upfront, and then attempting to extract more from the population to secure their profit. This system was efficient for the treasury, but deeply unpopular among provincials, who viewed the publicani as greedy and oppressive. Complaints and petitions flowed back to Rome, and reforms were occasionally attempted, but the system persisted because it kept money flowing to the center of power. Over time, emperors sought to bring more of this work under direct imperial control, reducing the influence of tax farmers and relying instead on salaried officials. Still, the perception of taxes as both necessary and burdensome remained constant. Customs duties also provided revenue, and these were collected at toll stations scattered across the empire. At bridges, ports, and mountain passes, officials weighed goods, calculated values, and recorded fees. A merchant carrying a shipment of wine from Gaul into Italy would pay a duty, while another transporting olive oil from Spain to Rome would face the same process. The rates were often small, but because the volume of trade was immense, the revenue was significant. This steady stream of income funded legions, supplied grain to the capital, and supported the imperial court. The dull growth of taxation was most evident in its records. Roman administration produced endless documents, lists of names, inventories of goods, accounts of payments. Scribes worked in dusty offices, copying figures with wax tablets and styluses, later transferring them to papyrus or parchment. These records were rarely dramatic, but they provided continuity, ensuring that obligations were remembered and payments tracked. To imagine this side of Roman life is to picture not the grandeur of marble temples, but the quiet scratch of styluses across wax, the muttered counting of coins, the careful sealing of documents for storage. For ordinary people, taxes were a fact of life woven into their yearly routines. A farmer expected that part of his harvest would go to the state. A merchant knew that tolls awaited him at city gates. A craftsman might pay fees on sales, while a wealthy citizen faced inheritance taxes when passing property to his heirs. No one was exempt, not even the emperor's own families, for Augustus himself was careful to insist that members of his household pay the inheritance tax, a gesture meant to reinforce the fairness of the system. The history of Roman taxes is boring precisely because it was so regular, so predictable, and so persistent. It did not depend on brilliant generals or dramatic battles, but on clerks, collectors, and the steady compliance of millions of people. This dull routine, repeated year after year, century after century, created the financial foundation upon which the empire rested. The tax system of Rome, dull and repetitive though it was, reveals much about the way the empire understood power and order. Taxes were not simply a way to raise money, they were also a constant reminder of authority, a thread that tied each individual, each town, each province to the heart of the empire. When a farmer in Egypt handed over part of his grain harvest to officials, when a merchant in Gaul paid a duty at the city gate, when a family in Asia Minor paid the inheritance tax on property left by a relative, each act reinforced the reality of Roman rule. It was not the thunder of legions that reminded people of the empire every day, but the quiet hand of the tax collector. The Roman state managed this with a bureaucracy that was both tedious and effective. In Egypt, one of the most valuable provinces, taxes were meticulously organized. Grain collected there was shipped directly to Rome, filling the great storehouses that fed the population of the capital. Receipts were issued, records copied, and quotas tracked with precision. Surviving papyri from Egypt show how detailed this system was. Names of taxpayers, amounts of grain or money delivered, even notes on delays or disputes. Reading these documents today is not exciting. They are lists, numbers, names, and figures. Yet they demonstrate how carefully the empire ensured that its resources flowed without interruption. In other provinces, taxes were adjusted to local conditions. In some places, payments were made in kind, grain, oil, or livestock, while in others, coin was preferred. The dull growth of Roman taxes was in this flexibility, the ability to adapt the same principle of extraction to different circumstances. What mattered was not the form of payment, but the steady flow of resources to the state. This flexibility, repeated over generations, made taxation a constant that outlasted emperors, wars, and even economic crises. For citizens in Rome itself, taxes were less direct, for much of the cost of supporting the capital was borne by the provinces. Rome consumed, and the provinces provided. Grain shipments from Egypt, Africa, and Sicily fed the city, arriving in great convoys of ships. These shipments were secured by provincial taxes, and their steady arrival kept the Roman population loyal and quiet. Without them, unrest would have threatened the stability of emperors. In this way, the dull routine of taxation became the invisible foundation of political survival. There were, of course, moments of resistance. Provinces sometimes rebelled against heavy burdens, and tax collectors were not loved. Stories circulated of corruption, of officials enriching themselves at the expense of the people. Emperors occasionally reformed the system, promising fairness, adjusting rates, or reducing abuses. Yet the overall structure remained the same. Taxes had to be collected, records had to be kept, and the empire had to be fed. The dull persistence of the system mattered more than the rare moments of change. Over time, taxation also became a way of defining social status. Citizens and non-citizens were taxed differently, with certain privileges reserved for Roman citizens. Poll taxes, for example, were often imposed only on non-citizens, a reminder of their lower status within the imperial order. Over generations, however, as citizenship expanded, these distinctions blurred, and taxes became more universal. The dull growth of Roman taxes was therefore also the dull growth of Roman identity, as fiscal obligations slowly became shared across a broader population. To picture the world of Roman taxes is to imagine not scenes of drama, but of routine. Scribes sitting in dusty offices, clerks writing names into ledgers, officials weighing sacks of grain, merchants handing over coins at gates, farmers lining up with portions of harvest. These were the true sounds of empire, not trumpets, not cheers, but the quiet repetition of collection, the slow accumulation of wealth that kept the Roman state alive. As the Roman Empire expanded, its tax system expanded with it, not through sudden reforms or dramatic policies, but through the steady, dull growth of bureaucracy, the quiet extension of rules into each new province. Every territory conquered by Rome was folded into the tax network, its resources assessed, its population recorded, its obligations defined. This process was repetitive and predictable. Officials arrived, conducted a census, and determined what each community owed in tribute, whether in coin, crops, or livestock. The system was not exciting, but it was thorough, and over time it created an invisible web of obligation stretching across the empire. The empire relied heavily on agriculture, and so land taxes became the foundation of revenue. Farmers in Gaul, Hispania, Africa, and Asia Minor all delivered portions of their harvest to local collection points. Grain, olives, and wine flowed steadily from countryside to city, feeding populations and supplying soldiers. This routine never ceased, even during wars, for armies could not march without food. The dullness of this process was its strength. It required no innovation, only persistence. Fields were planted, crops were harvested, shares were collected, and the empire was sustained. Alongside agriculture came the poll taxes levied on individuals, a steady reminder of subjugation in the provinces. These taxes were deeply unpopular but unavoidable, as they were carefully recorded in census registers. Clerks listed names, ages, and occupations, and assessed the sums due. To read these records today is to see page after page of ordinary details, but behind those details was the daily machinery of empire. No dramatic battles were needed to keep Rome powerful, only the quiet acceptance of taxes by millions of people, year after year. The empire also depended on customs duties collected at countless checkpoints. Bridges, ports, and mountain passes became slow bottlenecks of trade, where merchants paused while officials calculated percentages and scribes recorded payments. To the merchant, these moments were tedious. To the state, they were essential. A jar of oil from Hispania, a shipment of marble from Greece, a cartload of pottery from North Africa. All paid their share as they passed. The sums were small, but in their repetition, they built the vast wealth of Rome. The dull growth of this system is what made it endure. Unlike dramatic reforms, which come and go, routine taxes persisted because they were built into the structure of life. Farmers planted knowing part of their crop would go to the state. Merchants traded knowing tolls awaited them. Families transferred property knowing inheritance taxes would be taken. This certainty, though resented, made the system predictable and thus sustainable. Even emperors recognized that stability mattered more than generosity. Occasionally, taxes were reduced to win favor, or increased in times of crisis, but for the most part, they remained steady, familiar, and dull. Bureaucracy supported all of this. Scribes filled their days with ledgers, officials traveled through towns collecting dues, receipts were issued and archived. Offices were filled with the scratch of pens on wax tablets, the counting of coins, the weighing of grain. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was essential. Without this background hum of administration, the empire could not have fed its capital, could not have supplied its legions, could not have built its roads and aqueducts. For ordinary people, taxes were a burden, but they were also part of the rhythm of life. As certain as the seasons, they complained, they grumbled, but they paid because they had no choice. And in their quiet compliance lay the real power of Rome. The boring history of Roman taxes, then, is a history of routine, of ledgers and harvests, of toll gates and receipts, of countless small contributions that, when added together, sustained an empire for centuries. The endurance of the Roman Empire rested as much on its taxation system as on its armies, for legions could not march without pay. Cities could not function without grain, and aqueducts, roads, and harbors could not be built without revenue. Yet the way taxes provided the support was not dramatic, but slow, steady, and repetitive. Each year, the same rituals took place. Officials conducting censuses, scribes writing names into ledgers, farmers handing over portions of their crops, merchants paying duties at gates, and families calculating fees owed on inheritances. It was through these countless ordinary acts that Rome maintained its extraordinary scale. One of the most important aspects of taxation was its local administration. Though decrees came from emperors in Rome, the actual collection was handled in towns and villages by local officials who knew the land and the people. This decentralization made the system more efficient, but it also meant that taxation became woven into the fabric of everyday community life. A farmer might know the name of the official who came to collect his grain, or a merchant might recognize the scribe who recorded his payment at a toll station. The empire's vastness was made tangible through these small encounters, repeated endlessly across its territories. In Egypt, where grain shipments were crucial for feeding the capital, taxes were collected with extraordinary precision. Farmers brought their harvests to granaries, where officials measured, weighed, and stored them. Receipts were issued on papyrus, detailing the amounts delivered. These documents, many of which survive today, show the dull thoroughness of the system, lists of names, figures of weight, and notes about delays or substitutions. Reading them is tedious, yet they reveal how carefully the empire managed its lifeline. Without such records, Rome itself might have starved. In other regions, taxes were collected in coin, especially where trade was vibrant. Gold and silver flowed into imperial treasuries, funding legions stationed along the frontiers. Soldiers depended on these steady payments, for loyalty and discipline were reinforced by wages. The dull rhythm of taxation thus underpinned even the might of the army. Behind every legionary's armor and weapon stood the quiet work of clerks, the routine collection of duties, and the boring persistence of financial administration. Customs duties remained a constant feature of Roman taxation, and these were encountered not only by foreign merchants, but by locals moving goods between provinces. Toll stations dotted the empire, their presence a reminder that every crossing of a boundary carried a cost. Traders grew used to the delays, the weighing of goods, the counting of coins. They may have sighed or grumbled, but they paid, for this was the price of moving within the empire. The sums were rarely crushing, but they were constant, and their accumulation fed the treasury. Even death provided revenue. The inheritance tax, established by Augustus, ensured that wealth passed from one generation to the next, only after the state had taken its share. This 5% levy may have seemed small, but over the centuries it became a significant source of income. Families planned for it, adjusted their estates, and accepted it as another dull certainty of life under Rome. In this way, taxation reached into every stage of existence, from birth, when individuals were recorded in the census, to death, when inheritances were taxed. It was ever present, always there, a quiet thread binding each life to the state. What made Roman taxes so effective was not brilliance, but persistence. There was little innovation, little spectacle, but there was continuity. The system adapted to local conditions, endured through political upheaval, and functioned with a stability that outlasted emperors. In the end, the boring history of Roman taxes is a reminder that empires are not sustained by glory alone, but by the dull, patient machinery of administration. The scratch of pens, the weight of grain, the clink of coins, repeated endlessly, century after century. The dull persistence of Roman taxes is perhaps most clearly seen in how they shaped the daily rhythm of both city and countryside. In the great city of Rome, the population depended on the steady arrival of grain, much of it funded by provincial taxation. Ships filled with wheat from Egypt and North Africa sailed into Roman harbors, their cargo measured, accounted for, and distributed. Citizens of the capital lined up for the grain dole, or annona, a system by which the state provided food to the urban poor. Behind this public generosity was the dull machinery of taxes, the collection of harvests far away, the storage of grain in warehouses, and the careful scheduling of shipments. For those living in the city, taxes were not seen in the fields, but tasted in bread. In the countryside, the experience was different. Farmers delivered their obligations directly to collection points, sometimes in kind, sometimes in coin. The amounts were carefully assessed, disputes settled in dusty offices by clerks whose daily work left little trace in history. Surviving inscriptions and papyri show the humdrum details: names of villagers, quantities of grain, dates of payment. These documents are monotonous to read, but they reveal how taxation was embedded in the ordinary routines of agricultural life. Each season brought planting, harvest, and the inevitable demand for the state's share. Beyond grain and money, taxes were sometimes collected in labor. Communities were required to provide workers for roads, bridges, and fortifications. These obligations were dull and burdensome, yet they reinforced the infrastructure that bound the empire together. Roads extended across Europe, the Near East, and North Africa, enabling legions to march quickly and goods to move efficiently. Aqueducts carried water into cities, their construction supported by the quiet demands of taxation. Temples, baths, and amphitheaters, while remembered as monuments of Roman culture, were financed not by sudden acts of generosity, but by the steady accumulation of tax revenue. Another feature of the Roman system was its adaptability. Different provinces had different arrangements depending on their traditions and economies. In some places, such as Judea, taxation was particularly resented, leading to unrest and rebellion. In others, like Egypt, the system was accepted with resignation because it had long been under strict administrative control. Rome did not impose a uniform structure everywhere, but instead adapted, incorporating local practices into its broader framework. This flexibility allowed the system to persist, dull in its uniformity of purpose, but varied in its details. The perception of taxation was always negative, as it is in every age. Writers and satirists complained about corrupt officials, greedy collectors, and unfair burdens. Yet even these complaints reveal the inevitability of taxes, for no one imagined life without them. They were the backdrop against which all else occurred. Soldiers were paid, cities were built, and festivals were funded, all because of the quiet certainty of taxation. What made the Roman tax system enduring was not efficiency alone, but its sheer continuity. While emperors changed, while civil wars raged, while borders shifted, the tax system endured. Even conquerors who seized power understood that to rule Rome was to maintain its revenues, for without them, there was no empire. Thus, taxation became one of the most stable and unchanging features of Roman life. To imagine this dull continuity is to picture endless repetition. A farmer bringing sacks of wheat to a granary, a merchant paying a toll at a city gate, a clerk noting figures in a ledger, a family surrendering a portion of inheritance. None of these moments were dramatic, yet together they supported the grandeur of Rome. The boring history of Roman taxes is therefore a story of routine, of monotony, of unending cycles that sustained a world power, not through brilliance, but through persistence. The story of Roman taxes in its dull endurance also reveals how deeply it was tied to the identity of empire. The Roman state defined itself not only by its armies or its laws, but by its ability to extract resources from its subjects year after year without interruption. Taxation became a language of power, a quiet but constant reminder that Rome was present in every life, no matter how distant from the capital. For the citizen farmer in Italy, the obligations may have felt modest, a percentage of harvest or small payments at markets. For the provincial villager in Gaul or Judea, the burden could feel heavier, particularly when local officials or tax farmers demanded more than was fair. Yet in every case, the act of paying tied people to Rome in ways that battles and monuments never could. The dullness of the tax system lay in its predictability. It was always there, always expected, part of the cycle of the year, like planting and harvest. Communities planned for it, just as families planned for marriages or festivals. In this way, the machinery of the empire was embedded in ordinary life. The quiet persistence of taxation meant that Rome's presence was never absent, even in remote villages where no legionary ever marched. Taxes touched everyone. In the cities, merchants passed through gates where duties were assessed. In the countryside, farmers delivered grain to granaries. At death, inheritance taxes were claimed. Slaves sold in markets were taxed as property, their very existence recorded in ledgers. The empire was vast, but the net of taxation was wider still, catching each life in its routine. To manage this scale, Rome relied on bureaucracy that was as tedious as it was effective. Records had to be copied, receipts stored, quotas checked. The empire trained scribes who spent their lives in dull offices, scratching figures into wax tablets and papyrus scrolls. They were anonymous and forgettable, but their work held the empire together. In their columns of numbers lay the wages of soldiers, the grain for Rome, the funds for bridges and aqueducts. Without them, the grand image of the empire would have collapsed. The dull growth of taxes was not only economic, but cultural. Over centuries, people came to expect taxation as part of life. Even complaints became routine. Writers satirized greedy collectors, villagers muttered about unfair burdens, but no one imagined a world without taxes. They were as much a feature of Rome as its roads or its baths. This acceptance, born of repetition, gave Rome its resilience. Wars could interrupt trade, emperors could rise and fall, but the taxes always returned, steady as the seasons. At times, reforms were attempted. Some emperors reduced rates to gain favor. Others increased them to pay for wars or public works. Yet these changes were only adjustments to the same system, never its replacement. The structure remained dull and persistent across centuries. Even as the empire faced crisis in its later years, taxation remained central, sometimes more heavily enforced, sometimes resisted, but always present. The boring reality of Roman taxes is that they were not brilliant, not innovative, and not exciting. They were routine, monotonous, and inescapable. Yet it was precisely this monotony that made them effective. The empire endured not because of constant victories, but because of constant revenues. To imagine this is to picture endless cycles of ordinary scenes: sacks of grain weighed at a granary, coins counted in a toll booth, names written into census lists, inheritance divided under the watchful eye of clerks. These quiet moments sustained legions, funded aqueducts, fed cities, and kept the empire alive. In their dull repetition, they became the true foundation of Rome's greatness. The dull continuity of Roman taxation carried with it not only economic weight, but also social consequences that quietly shaped the empire over centuries. Taxes were not distributed equally, and the way burdens fell revealed much about Roman society. Wealthy landowners often had more resources to negotiate or manage their obligations, while poorer farmers and villagers felt the weight more directly. In some provinces, local elites were tasked with ensuring tax quotas were met, which meant that they themselves became responsible for collecting from their neighbors. This arrangement tied local elites to the empire, in a relationship both useful and resented. Useful because it gave them status and authority, resented because they were often blamed for the burden of Rome's demands. The system was dull in its predictability, but it was also harsh in its certainty. Taxes did not wait for good harvests or favorable trade. Even in times of famine or drought, obligations remained. A poor yield might ruin a farmer not because the land failed, but because the tax was fixed. Complaints were voiced, petitions sent, and occasionally remissions were granted. But the machinery of taxation was relentless. It ground on, year after year, because the empire depended upon it. Cities consumed grain, soldiers demanded pay, roads needed maintenance, and aqueducts required constant repair. Without taxes, the empire's facade of grandeur would have crumbled. Another dull but significant aspect of Roman taxation was the use of taxes to define citizenship and privilege. Citizens were exempt from certain direct taxes, such as the poll tax imposed on provincials, which made Roman citizenship valuable beyond its symbolic meaning. Over time, as more people across the empire were granted citizenship, these distinctions blurred and taxation shifted toward more universal forms. Yet the principle remained. Taxes defined who was inside the privileged circle of Roman identity and who remained outside. The boring history of taxation thus intersected quietly with the slow transformation of Roman society. Emperors themselves understood the political importance of taxes. Augustus presented his inheritance tax as a fair measure that even his family would pay. Vespasian introduced new levies, including the infamous tax on public urinals, joking that money has no smell. These anecdotes, though memorable, are the rare moments of color in an otherwise dull system. Most taxes were not amusing or remarkable. They were routine, administered quietly by officials and endured silently by the people. The empire's stability rested not only on armies and governors, but on the ability of this dull system to keep functioning through every crisis. The dull growth of taxation was also seen in the infrastructure it supported. Each coin collected, each sack of grain delivered, each fee paid at a toll gate contributed to a vast pool of resources that allowed Rome to build and maintain. Aqueducts brought water to cities, baths were supplied, forums paved, and amphitheaters constructed. The people who paid these taxes may not have linked their burdens to these monuments, but the connection was real. Without taxes, there would have been no Colosseum, no paved roads stretching for thousands of miles, no legions guarding the frontiers. The boring, everyday act of taxation made possible the grandeur that history remembers. Yet for those who lived it, taxes were never grand, only tedious. To imagine the life of an ordinary Roman under this system is to see a farmer calculating how much of his grain to set aside for collectors, a merchant pausing at yet another toll booth to count out coins, a scribe hunched over wax tablets, adding columns of numbers, a provincial governor reviewing ledgers late into the night. These were not moments of excitement, but they were the threads from which the empire was woven. The boring history of Roman taxes is a reminder that great empires are sustained less by sudden triumphs than by slow, dull routines that persist through generations. As the long story of Roman taxation reaches its quiet conclusion, it becomes clear that the system's greatest strength was not brilliance or efficiency, but dull persistence. For centuries, while emperors changed, wars erupted, and provinces shifted hands, the machinery of taxation continued almost unchanged, humming in the background of daily life. It was the unseen foundation of empire, invisible in moments of glory, yet indispensable to every triumph. Without taxes, Rome could not have fed its vast population, paid its soldiers, or built the monuments that still stand today. Yet taxes did all this not through sudden bursts of revenue, but through countless small contributions, repeated patiently over generations. The true history of Roman taxes is not the drama of rebellion or reform, but the monotony of routine. Farmers harvested their fields and delivered the state's portion, regardless of whether the year was good or bad. Merchants counted coins at toll stations. Their journeys slowed but never halted. Families paid inheritance taxes. Scribes recorded numbers in ledgers, and officials stored receipts in archives. Each of these moments was dull, ordinary, and repetitive. Yet together, they sustained an empire that lasted for centuries. The monotony of taxation was also its stability. Because taxes were expected, people planned for them. Communities adjusted their economies. Families set aside portions of income, and merchants calculated costs with duties in mind. Taxes became part of the natural rhythm of life, as certain as the seasons, as unavoidable as death. Complaints persisted, but compliance endured. This quiet compliance was Rome's true victory, for it meant that millions of people, scattered across vast distances, contributed to the same treasury, upheld the same system, and accepted the same obligations. The boring growth of taxes also ensured that Rome's achievements outlasted the empire itself. Roads, aqueducts, bridges, and harbors, all funded by the slow accumulation of revenue, survived long after Rome's legions had vanished. Even in decline, as pressures mounted and invasions spread, taxation remained one of the last functions to persist, a stubborn reminder of the state's presence. The Western Empire collapsed in the 5th century, yet the idea of taxation as the backbone of governance did not die. It carried into successor kingdoms, into medieval states, into modern nations. Rome's dull routine of collecting and recording became a template for the future, proving that administration, though boring, is as vital as conquest. To picture the end of the story is not to see drama, but to imagine once more the quiet routines that defined it from the beginning. In a provincial village, a farmer still hands over grain to collectors. At a city gate, a merchant still pauses to pay tolls. In an office, a clerk still scratches figures onto tablets, adding columns of numbers, sealing receipts for storage. These scenes are not exciting, but they are the true legacy of Rome. The empire's glory may shine in marble ruins, but its endurance rested on the dull weight of taxes. As you drift into rest, imagine not the roar of gladiators or the clash of legions, but the quiet scratch of styluses, the clink of coins into strongboxes, the shuffle of parchment in dusty archives. Imagine the endless repetition of collection, day after day, year after year, century after century, sustaining a world that otherwise would have collapsed under its own weight. The boring history of Roman taxes reminds us that empires are not held together by spectacle alone, but by patience, routine, and the dull persistence of countless unseen hands. That is the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you will always have a calm place to return to each night. And now, let us continue our Boring History for Sleep series with the next story: grain shipments across the Mediterranean. The Roman world, for all its grandeur, depended on something as ordinary as grain. The supply of wheat and barley was the quiet foundation upon which the empire stood, for without bread the people of Rome would starve, and without steady shipments the great city could not exist. At its height, Rome had a population of nearly 1 million, a number unmatched by any other city of antiquity, and feeding such a multitude required a logistical system both dull and extraordinary. Grain was gathered from the provinces, stored in granaries, loaded onto ships, and carried across the Mediterranean in a process that repeated year after year, century after century. It was not dramatic like battles or conquests, but it was relentless, a cycle that sustained the empire in its daily life. The story of these shipments begins in the fertile fields of Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, the breadbaskets of the Roman world. Farmers sowed their fields with wheat, harvested in long, hot summers, and delivered portions of their yield to state officials as part of their tax obligations. These obligations were carefully measured and recorded. In Egypt, papyrus receipts tracked each delivery, listing names, amounts, and dates. In North Africa, provincial governors oversaw shipments bound for Rome. None of this was glamorous, but it was essential. Grain was the empire's lifeblood, and its collection was managed with dull precision. Once collected, The grain had to be stored until it could be shipped. Granaries lined the ports of Alexandria, Carthage, and Ostia. These were vast, plain buildings, their walls thick to protect against heat and pests, their interiors filled with sacks or piles of grain. Workers moved steadily, carrying loads, stacking them carefully, sealing them against moisture. Day after day, they performed the same tasks, their labor unnoticed in history. Yet without them, the city of Rome would have gone hungry. When the time came, the grain was transferred to ships, and here another routine began. Roman grain ships were large, capable of carrying thousands of sacks at once. They were not swift or elegant, but broad and heavy, designed for cargo rather than speed. At the docks, crews loaded them patiently, sack after sack, until the holds were full and the decks piled high. Officials recorded each load, scribes checked lists, and overseers ensured that quotas were met. It was tedious, repetitive, and dull, but it was the process that kept Rome alive. The voyages themselves were long and often monotonous. Ships set sail from Alexandria or Carthage, their sails catching the Mediterranean winds, their crews settling into routines of navigation and maintenance. For days at a time, nothing happened beyond the slow progress of the ship across calm seas. Sailors repaired ropes, adjusted sails, cooked simple meals, and passed the hours with conversation. Only occasionally did storms or pirates interrupt the dullness, but most of the time the voyages were steady and uneventful. In this dullness lay their importance. Each successful crossing meant that the grain reached Rome, that bread could be baked, that the people would remain quiet. In Rome itself, the arrival of grain was marked not by celebration, but by routine distribution. Grain was unloaded at Ostia, carried up the Tiber River in barges, and deposited in warehouses. From there, it was handed out as part of the annona, the state grain dole that fed hundreds of thousands of citizens. People lined up to receive their allotments, carrying sacks or baskets, waiting their turn. Officials recorded names, checked quotas, and ensured that each person received what was due. It was not a spectacle, but a system, dull and repetitive, yet utterly essential to the life of the city. To imagine the grain shipments across the Mediterranean is to see not drama, but patience. Farmers harvesting fields, clerks recording deliveries, workers loading ships, sailors crossing seas, and citizens queuing quietly for their share of bread. The process was boring, but in its repetition, it sustained an empire. The system of grain shipments that sustained Rome grew slowly, steadily, and without spectacle, shaped by the quiet necessities of feeding a vast urban population. At the core of the system were the provinces, each integrated into the machinery of supply, through dull but predictable obligations. Egypt, conquered by Augustus in 30 BCE, quickly became the most important source of grain. Its fertile Nile Valley produced abundant harvests, and much of that grain was earmarked for shipment to Rome. Each year, when the Nile's flood receded, farmers sowed wheat across the rich soil, reaping it months later under the watchful eye of state officials. The harvest was measured, a portion taken as tax, and then transported to collection centers. From there it moved to Alexandria, where warehouses and granaries held immense reserves waiting to be loaded onto ships. The same pattern repeated in North Africa, particularly in the provinces of Africa Proconsularis and Numidia, where fertile lands yielded steady crops. Sicily too contributed, though on a smaller scale, its fields harvested to meet quotas established generations earlier when it was Rome's first overseas possession. These provincial contributions were not optional. They were enforced with the dull persistence of bureaucracy. Governors ensured quotas were met, clerks kept records, and taxes in kind became the empire's lifeline. Once in Alexandria or Carthage, the next stage of the process unfolded: preparation for transport. The grain was packed into sacks or stored in amphorae, carefully sealed to prevent spoilage. Workers carried them to docks, where grain ships stood ready. These vessels, broad and slow, were designed specifically for heavy cargo. The process of loading was repetitive and laborious. Sack after sack was carried aboard, balanced carefully to avoid capsizing, while officials checked lists against cargo. It was not a quick task, but one that took days, even weeks, depending on the size of the fleet. The departure itself was anticlimactic. There were no ceremonies, no celebrations, just ships leaving port, sails rising against the wind as they set out across the sea. The voyage from Alexandria to Rome was long, often lasting several weeks. Crews settled into monotony, maintaining rigging, steering by stars, cooking simple meals, and watching the horizon. The Mediterranean was not always kind. Sudden storms could threaten entire fleets, and pirates prowled certain waters. Yet most voyages passed in dull repetition, waves rolling endlessly, days blending together. This monotony was a blessing, for uneventful journeys meant grain would arrive intact. Once ships reached Ostia, Rome's harbor, the cycle continued with the same quiet persistence. Cargo was unloaded into warehouses, each sack counted, each shipment recorded. From Ostia, smaller boats carried grain upriver to Rome itself, where more warehouses waited. The distribution system, known as the annona, ensured that citizens of the capital received their share. Lines formed, clerks checked names, and grain was handed out in measured portions. For the people, this was routine, as familiar as the rising sun. They expected bread, and they expected the state to provide it. The entire system functioned not through brilliance, but through repetition. Farmers planted and harvested, governors enforced quotas, workers loaded ships, sailors crossed seas, and citizens collected their bread. Each step was ordinary, dull, and predictable, yet together they sustained a city of 1 million people, something unprecedented in the ancient world. To imagine grain shipments across the Mediterranean is to picture endless cycles of harvest, transport, storage, and distribution, carried out by countless anonymous individuals whose names are forgotten, but whose labor made Rome possible. Their work was not celebrated, but it was constant, and in its constancy lay the strength of the empire. The routine of Roman grain shipments was supported by layers of organization so dull and repetitive that they rarely receive attention in history. Yet they formed the true backbone of the empire. At the heart of this organization was the annona, the grain supply system overseen by officials who managed the constant flow of food from the provinces to the capital. The annona was not a single office, but a vast network of administrators, clerks, overseers, and dock workers, each performing small tasks that together kept Rome fed. Their work was bureaucratic and monotonous, drafting contracts with ship owners, issuing receipts for grain delivered, checking weights at warehouses, and resolving disputes over quality or quantity. Year after year, these dull routines unfolded, invisible to most of the population yet essential for their survival. Grain shipments from Egypt illustrate this system at its most impressive. Once harvested, Egyptian grain traveled down the Nile on barges, drifting slowly toward Alexandria. This leg of the journey was as dull as it was necessary. Crews steered their boats through the currents, stopping at river docks to load more cargo. The pace was dictated by the river itself, steady and unhurried. By the time the grain reached Alexandria, it was carefully transferred into massive granaries that lined the harbor. From there, fleets of Roman grain ships carried it westward across the Mediterranean. These fleets were organized in convoys for protection, though the majority of their journeys were uneventful, filled with days of calm seas and repetitive work. The crews of these ships lived lives of monotony. Sailors adjusted sails, patched ropes, cooked simple meals, and steered by the stars. Nights were filled with the sound of waves and creaking timbers, days with endless horizons. Occasionally storms or pirates brought danger, but most voyages passed in uneventful silence. It was the dull success of these voyages that mattered, for the safe delivery of grain meant stability in Rome. At Ostia, the harbor near the capital, the process repeated in reverse. Ships were unloaded with slow precision. Workers carried sacks into warehouses. Officials counted each load, and scribes noted amounts in records. Barges then moved the grain upriver to Rome, where more granaries awaited. These warehouses, plain and functional, were the silent guardians of the city's survival. Within their walls, grain was stored until distributed to citizens. The annona provided free or subsidized grain to hundreds of thousands of people, and this dole was one of the key ways emperors maintained public order. Bread was not merely food, it was politics. Hungry citizens were restless citizens, and emperors understood that steady grain meant peace. Thus, the dull repetition of grain shipments became a political necessity. Every sack unloaded at Ostia was a step toward maintaining stability in the capital. For the ordinary citizen, the system was visible only at the point of distribution. People lined up at designated locations, their names checked against lists, and their shares of grain measured carefully. Families carried home their portions, ground it into flour, and baked the bread that sustained them. This process was so ordinary, so regular, that it became part of the rhythm of life in Rome. Few thought about the distant fields of Egypt or Africa, the long voyages of ships, or the tedious work of officials. All that mattered was that the bread was there. The boring history of grain shipments is thus a story of repetition and routine. Farmers planted, harvesters reaped, barges floated, ships sailed, warehouses filled, clerks recorded, and citizens received. Each step was dull in itself, but together they created one of the most remarkable logistical systems of the ancient world. Rome's glory rested not only on marble and legions, but on the quiet, steady arrival of grain, carried across the Mediterranean in endless cycles that kept the empire alive. The grain shipments that sustained Rome reveal how an empire of monuments and armies relied upon the dull but dependable rhythms of agriculture, transportation, and record-keeping. To maintain a population of nearly 1 million in the capital required not a burst of energy, but the careful repetition of countless small tasks. Every year the cycle began again in the provinces, where sowing and harvesting were tied to the seasons. In Egypt, the rise and fall of the Nile dictated the calendar. Farmers planted when the waters receded, reaped in the dry months, and delivered their share as tax. In North Africa, fields were plowed and sown with the same monotony, watched over by officials who ensured quotas were met. Sicily too produced wheat, though its role diminished as other provinces became more important. None of these harvests was dramatic, but together they filled the granaries that sustained Rome. Once gathered, the grain followed familiar paths. In Egypt, it floated down the Nile on barges, their sails catching the wind, their crews guiding them patiently toward Alexandria. In Africa, it was transported by cart and stored in coastal depots before shipment. In Sicily, the process was shorter, but no less repetitive. At each stage, scribes recorded amounts, receipts were issued, and quotas checked. By the time the grain reached the great warehouses near the sea, it was already layered with paperwork, names, and numbers, each one representing a farmer's obligation and a bureaucrat's calculation. The ships that carried this grain were themselves products of routine. Built for cargo, not speed, they were broad and heavy, their holds designed for thousands of sacks. Loading was slow, involving long chains of workers carrying loads from warehouse to dock to ship. Overseers checked every sack, scribes ticked names off lists, and inspectors ensured weight and quality. The work was exhausting but repetitive, performed season after season with little variation. When fleets departed, it was without spectacle, only the creaking of wood, the snapping of sails, and the long push into open water. The Mediterranean was the stage for this monotony. Voyages lasted weeks, sometimes months, depending on wind and weather. Days passed with little change. Sailors repaired rigging, adjusted sails, steered by stars, and cooked simple meals. The sea stretched endlessly, horizon blending with sky. On calm days, the journey was dull. On stormy days, dangerous. Yet it was the uneventful voyages that mattered most, for safe arrivals meant Rome would be fed. At Ostia, the port of Rome, the dull cycle continued. Unloading mirrored loading, workers formed lines, carrying sacks from ship to shore, depositing them in warehouses. Clerks checked lists again, counting and recording. From Ostia, barges transported the grain up the Tiber River to Rome itself. There, more warehouses stood ready, plain buildings with thick walls to protect the grain from heat and pests. Inside, workers stacked sacks carefully, leaving narrow paths for inspection. The air was filled with dust and the smell of wheat, a sensory reminder of the city's dependence on faraway fields. Finally, the grain reached the people through the Annona, the state distribution system. Citizens lined up, their names checked against rolls, their shares measured and handed over. Families carried their allotments home, ground it into flour, and baked bread. To them, the process was routine, expected, even dull, but its reliability was what kept the city alive. The glory of Rome rested not on marble arches or bronze statues, but on the steady arrival of bread, year after year, from fields across the Mediterranean. The boring history of grain shipments is therefore not a story of adventure, but of patience, repetition, and routine. It is the story of farmers planting in silence, of sailors crossing seas under quiet skies, of clerks scratching figures into wax tablets, and of citizens queuing for their share. None of it was glamorous, but all of it was essential. The importance of grain shipments across the Mediterranean becomes most evident when we realize how fragile Rome's food supply truly was. A single bad harvest in one province could cause shortages, and delays in shipping could lead to unrest in the capital. The people of Rome depended on the annona, the state grain distribution system, and they expected it to function smoothly. Any disruption threatened not only hunger, but political stability, for emperors knew that a restless crowd in the Forum could turn quickly into a dangerous mob. To prevent such crises, the machinery of collection and shipment was maintained with the dull persistence of routine. Each year followed the same cycle. Farmers sowed and harvested, officials assessed and collected, ships were loaded and sailed, warehouses were filled, and citizens lined up for their rations. This cycle was as predictable as the seasons, and its repetition gave the empire resilience. Egypt's role in the system cannot be overstated. The Nile's fertile floodplains provided abundant harvests, and much of that grain was earmarked for Rome. Barges floated silently down the river, their holds filled with wheat, while crews guided them patiently toward Alexandria. There, vast granaries waited, plain in appearance but massive in scale. Each sack of grain was recorded, stored, and prepared for shipment. It was a dull process, involving endless counting, weighing, and sealing, but it ensured that the capital would not go hungry. From Alexandria, fleets of grain ships departed in convoys. These ships, broad and heavy, were designed to carry thousands of sacks at once. Their sails caught the winds of the Mediterranean, and their crews settled into long, monotonous voyages. Days stretched into weeks as the ships crossed open waters. Most of the time, nothing happened beyond the steady rhythm of waves against hulls and the creak of wood. Sailors adjusted ropes, cooked meals, and kept watch, but the journeys were otherwise uneventful. It was this very dullness that made the system work. Each uneventful crossing meant that grain arrived safely, that warehouses in Ostia filled, and that bread was available in Rome. Once at Ostia, the dull rhythm continued. Workers unloaded the ships, forming long lines as sacks were carried to warehouses. Clerks checked each delivery against records, counting carefully to ensure no shortfall. From Ostia, barges carried the grain upriver to Rome, where more warehouses waited. These buildings were functional, built for utility, not beauty, yet they were as important to the empire as temples or theaters. Inside, the grain was stacked high, inspected regularly, and guarded against pests and spoilage. Finally, the grain reached the people. The annona distributed it in measured portions, with citizens lining up to receive their share. Names were checked, amounts noted, and rations handed over. Families carried the grain home, ground it into flour, and baked bread. This routine was so ingrained that few thought about the long chain of labor behind it. To them, the grain was simply there, as expected. But behind their bread lay the toil of farmers in Egypt, the labor of sailors on the sea, the dull work of clerks in Ostia, and the monotony of record-keeping in Rome. The boring history of grain shipments is therefore a story of fragility managed through routine. Each stage, from harvest to distribution, depended on countless small acts of labor, none of them dramatic, all of them essential. It was through this dull persistence that Rome fed its people, preserved its peace, and sustained its empire. The grandeur of marble monuments and the glory of legions rested upon the quiet, steady movement of grain across the Mediterranean. A cycle repeated endlessly until it became invisible, yet always vital. The system of grain shipments across the Mediterranean, though dull in its routine, was one of the most carefully managed and most important lifelines of the Roman Empire. Its success lay not in brilliance or spectacle, but in the persistence of repetition. Each stage of the process was bound by habit, duty, and quiet labor. The farmers who tilled the fields of Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily worked according to seasons that had not changed for centuries, guided by the rise and fall of the Nile, the cycle of rainfall, and the demands of provincial governors. Their grain, gathered with patience, was handed over in quotas that had been calculated long before the harvest began. Officials recorded the amounts, scribes issued receipts, and overseers ensured that obligations were met. None of this was glamorous, but it was indispensable. Once the grain was gathered, the long journey toward Rome began. In Egypt, barges crowded with sacks drifted down the Nile, guided by men who had repeated the same journey countless times before. In North Africa, carts creaked across plains toward coastal depots where granaries waited. Each movement of grain was accompanied by clerks who counted, checked, and noted figures in ledgers. It was a world of records and receipts, of tallies and quotas, of dull but essential paperwork. At the ports of Alexandria and Carthage, warehouses stood as monuments of utility, their thick walls filled with grain piled high. Here, workers labored day after day, moving sacks into storage, preparing them for shipment. When fleets of Roman grain ships were ready, the process of loading began. Long lines of men carried sack after sack aboard, balancing the loads to prevent accidents, while overseers monitored the pace and scribes ticked off lists. It was exhausting work, repeated endlessly, with little variation from year to year. When the ships finally departed, sails billowing against the Mediterranean wind, their journeys were marked more by monotony than adventure. For weeks they crossed open waters, their crews caught in the rhythm of daily tasks. They steered by stars, repaired ropes, and waited for winds. The horizon remained empty, the sea unchanging, the days blending into one another. It was this uneventful monotony that allowed the system to succeed. For the safe, boring voyage was far more valuable than any tale of drama. On arrival at Ostia, the port near Rome, the entire cycle began again in reverse. Workers unloaded cargo into warehouses, sack by sack, while clerks checked each delivery. Barges then carried the grain upriver to Rome, where more warehouses stood ready. These storehouses, functional and plain, ensured that grain could be distributed steadily to the people. Without them, shortages would have quickly led to unrest. The annona, Rome's grain dole, was the final stage. Citizens lined up at designated points, their names checked against rolls, and their shares distributed in quiet routine. Families returned home with their allotments, ground the grain into flour, and baked bread. To them, it was not a marvel, but an expectation, as ordinary as sunrise. Yet this daily bread was the end result of an immense system of labor, stretching from fields in distant provinces across the sea to the capital itself. The importance of grain shipments lay not only in their scale, but in their predictability. Rome relied on them absolutely, and any disruption could provoke crisis. Emperors knew this, which is why they took personal responsibility for overseeing the annona. Their legitimacy, in part, rested on keeping bread in the hands of the people. Hungry citizens could turn against rulers quickly, but a steady supply of grain ensured calm. Thus, the dull, monotonous cycle of grain shipments was as much a political safeguard as an economic necessity. To imagine it fully is to picture the endless repetition of harvests, the quiet drift of barges, the heavy steps of dock workers, the scratching of styluses on wax, the creak of ships at sea, and the shuffle of citizens waiting patiently in line. It was not exciting, but it was enduring. And it was this endurance that allowed Rome to thrive. The steady movement of grain across the Mediterranean was not simply a matter of feeding the people of Rome. It was also a symbol of the empire's ability to organize, control, and endure. Every sack of wheat that traveled from Egypt or North Africa to the capital carried with it a reminder of Roman authority, for the grain supply was both an economic necessity and a political instrument. Emperors took personal interest in the annona, the system that oversaw the collection and distribution of grain, because they understood that the loyalty of the people depended on their ability to eat. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal observed, captured the truth. If the state provided food and entertainment, the masses remained quiet. Grain shipments, though dull, were therefore at the heart of imperial stability. The system was vast, but relied on endless small routines. In Egypt, after the harvest, farmers transported their contributions by boat down the Nile. The barges, laden with grain, moved at a slow pace, their crews accustomed to the long, repetitive journeys. At Alexandria, the cargo was unloaded into enormous granaries, where scribes recorded each delivery. Their work was monotonous, noting names, quantities, and dates on papyrus documents, checking weights, and issuing receipts. Yet these records formed the backbone of the empire's logistics. From Alexandria, fleets of grain ships sailed westward, sometimes numbering in the hundreds. Their journeys across the sea were uneventful more often than not. Sailors steered by stars, adjusted sails to catch the wind, and waited patiently for land to appear on the horizon. Days blended together, broken only by simple meals, minor repairs, or quiet conversations. Occasionally, storms threatened to upset the monotony, but most voyages were defined by dull endurance rather than drama. The arrival of these ships at Ostia brought no great celebration. Dockworkers lined up, unloading sack after sack into warehouses. Overseers checked lists, scribes ticked off amounts, and laborers repeated the same motions until ships were emptied. From Ostia, smaller vessels carried the grain up the Tiber River, where more warehouses stood ready in Rome. Inside these storehouses, grain was stacked in orderly rows, inspected regularly, and guarded carefully. The process had no grandeur, but it provided Rome with security. The final step was distribution. Citizens entitled to the grain dole lined up in quiet order, their names verified, their portions measured with care. Each person carried their share home, ground it into flour, and baked bread. This daily bread, so ordinary, was the product of a vast system of dull routines that stretched from distant fields across the sea to the very heart of the capital. The boring history of grain shipments also reminds us that much of what sustains civilizations is not dramatic but repetitive. Rome's greatness was not only in its battles or monuments, but in the patience of farmers planting seed, the persistence of sailors crossing calm waters, the diligence of clerks writing numbers into ledgers, and the endurance of citizens who trusted that bread would be there tomorrow as it had been yesterday. These small, dull acts were repeated endlessly, and together they made possible the survival of the largest city the ancient world had ever seen. The grain fleets that crossed the Mediterranean every year were so vital to Rome that their routine became one of the quiet rhythms of the empire. Unlike military campaigns or political decrees, which came and went with bursts of drama, the shipments were constant, expected, and repeated with dull persistence. Year after year, harvests were gathered, quotas measured, ships loaded, voyages completed, and distributions carried out. This continuity made the system invisible to many Romans, for when something functions so reliably, it fades into the background of daily life. Yet it was precisely this background hum of organization that sustained the city. Imagine the scenes in slow motion. In the fields of Egypt, farmers bent to their work, scythes cutting through golden stalks of wheat beneath the hot sun. They bundled the harvest into sheaves, carried them to collection points, and watched as officials recorded their contributions. Barges floated down the Nile, the same waters that had carried grain for generations. Sails stretched in the wind, crews guiding them steadily toward Alexandria. At the port, long lines of workers carried sacks into warehouses, their feet kicking up dust, their arms straining under weight. Inside the granaries, the air was thick with the smell of grain, a scent that symbolized sustenance itself. Clerks stood nearby, scratching figures onto papyrus, their styluses moving in repetitive strokes that filled column after column. The process never changed, and its predictability was its strength. When fleets departed, the Mediterranean became a silent highway of commerce. Grain ships were not swift. They lumbered slowly across the waters, built for cargo, not speed. Crews rose with the sun, tended to sails, patched ropes, and cooked simple meals in small hearths. At night, stars guided their course. The sea was vast, the horizon unchanging, and the days passed with little variation. Sailors grew accustomed to monotony, for monotony meant safety, and safety meant grain would reach Rome. Only rarely did storms or pirates disturb the dull rhythm, and even then the empire took steps to ensure recovery, for the supply of food could not be allowed to fail. When the fleets reached Ostia, the routine repeated in reverse. Unloading was as tedious as loading had been. Sacks were carried one by one into warehouses. Overseers checked weights, and scribes ticked off deliveries. Barges moved upriver, their cargo destined for the granaries of Rome. Within those stone walls, the grain was stacked high, inspected regularly, and guarded as though it were treasure, for in truth it was the most valuable treasure of all, the survival of the people. Distribution through the Annona was the final stage, and here the citizens of Rome experienced the benefits directly. They queued in long lines, their names checked against lists, their rations measured and handed over. Each person left with their portion, enough to sustain a household until the next distribution. To the people, It was a routine so familiar that few stopped to consider the vast network behind it. They saw only bread, yet that bread was the end result of thousands of dull, ordinary tasks performed across provinces, ports, seas, and cities. The boring history of grain shipments is therefore a story of patience, repetition, and trust. Rome trusted its provinces to supply grain, its sailors to cross the sea, its clerks to record accurately, and its officials to distribute fairly. This trust was not based on brilliance but on routine, not on speed but on endurance. The empire endured not through sudden brilliance but through countless small acts of persistence, repeated until they became the heartbeat of civilization. The steady arrival of grain fleets in Rome was more than an economic necessity. It was the silent foundation upon which the empire's political stability rested. Emperors understood that hungry citizens could become restless, and restless citizens could topple rulers. Thus, grain shipments across the Mediterranean were not merely about feeding mouths. They were about preserving peace. The phrase bread and circuses captured this truth, for bread, more than circuses, kept the people calm. Behind this calm, however, lay a network of endless routines, performed quietly by countless anonymous individuals. In the fields, the year began with sowing. Farmers turned the soil, scattered seed, and waited for harvest. When the time came, scythes cut through the wheat, bundles were tied, and quotas delivered. Officials measured and assessed. Clerks wrote figures into ledgers, and receipts were issued. The harvest was not celebrated with grandeur. It was measured, weighed, and recorded. Barges floated steadily down rivers, their holds filled with sacks of grain. At the ports, warehouses swallowed the harvest, dust filling the air as workers stacked sacks in long, monotonous rows. The ships that carried this grain to Rome were designed for weight, not beauty. They moved slowly across the Mediterranean, their progress measured not in hours or days, but in weeks. Crews lived in routines, adjusting sails, repairing ropes, steering by stars, and waiting for the next coastline to appear. Most voyages passed in uneventful silence, with nothing to mark one day from the next but the rising and setting of the sun. This dull monotony was the secret of the system's success, for safe, uneventful journeys meant grain reached Rome. At Ostia, unloading repeated the same cycle. Workers formed lines, carrying sacks from ships into granaries. Scribes ticked names off lists. Overseers checked weights, and barges carried the grain upriver to Rome. Inside the city's warehouses, the same monotony continued. Sacks stacked, records kept, inspections made. Distribution through Via Nona was equally routine. Citizens queued, names were checked, rations handed out, families carried grain home, ground it into flour, and baked bread. This bread was the final link in a chain that stretched back to distant fields in Egypt and Africa, across seas, through warehouses, and into the hands of ordinary people. The system functioned because each part was dull, predictable, and reliable. The boring history of grain shipments is thus the story of stability through monotony. It shows how Rome's greatness rested not on sudden brilliance, but on patient endurance. No single voyage, harvest, or record was remarkable, but the repetition of all these small acts created a structure that endured for centuries. Even emperors measured their success by the calm of grain supply. When shipments failed, unrest followed. When shipments succeeded, peace was maintained. To imagine it is to see the endless repetition of labor, farmers reaping fields, sailors crossing seas, clerks scratching numbers onto tablets, and citizens waiting patiently for their allotments. None of these scenes are dramatic, yet they were the true foundation of Rome. As the long story of grain shipments across the Mediterranean comes to a quiet close, it becomes clear that the empire's greatness rested not only on marble monuments or victorious legions, but on the steady, repetitive movement of wheat from distant provinces to the heart of Rome. The cycle was endless and unremarkable, yet it was the true lifeline of the city. Each stage, from the sowing of seed to the baking of bread, was part of a chain that stretched across hundreds of miles, involving countless hands performing dull but essential tasks. In Egypt, the Nile continued its annual flood, depositing fertile silt on the fields. Farmers sowed when the waters receded, harvested in due season, and delivered their share to officials. This process had gone on for centuries before Rome. and under Roman rule, it continued with added layers of bureaucracy. Clerks counted and recorded, receipts were issued, and quotas enforced. The work was monotonous, but it produced the grain that filled the ships in Alexandria's harbors. In North Africa, vast estates supplied wheat for export, their fields worked by laborers who repeated the same motions year after year. In Sicily, though smaller in scale, the same pattern unfolded, its harvest still significant in feeding Rome. At the ports, granaries stood as silent guardians of the empire's food supply. Inside their thick walls, sacks of grain were stacked in orderly rows, guarded against pests and spoilage. Workers moved constantly, carrying, storing, and preparing shipments. Their labor was exhausting but unchanging, and its repetition ensured that the capital would not starve. When fleets were ready, ships departed, broad and heavy, their sails filled with wind. Crews settled into the monotony of long voyages, adjusting sails, steering by stars, cooking simple meals, and watching the horizon. Most voyages were uneventful, filled with the quiet sounds of waves against hulls and the creak of ropes. It was this uneventfulness that mattered most, for safe journeys meant Rome's people would be fed. At Ostia, the port of Rome, unloading mirrored loading. Workers formed lines, passing sacks from ship to dock to warehouse. Overseers checked lists, scribes ticked off deliveries, and barges carried grain up the Tiber River to the city. There, in warehouses along the river, the grain was stored once more, waiting for distribution. The Annona, Rome's grain dole, transformed this vast system into daily bread for the people. Citizens queued in quiet order, their names checked, their portions measured. Families carried grain home, ground it into flour, and baked the loaves that sustained them. For them, the system was invisible. Bread was simply expected. Yet behind every loaf lay the labor of farmers, sailors, clerks, and workers, whose names are forgotten, but whose repetitive actions kept the empire alive. The boring history of grain shipments teaches that the endurance of Rome depended not on brilliance or glory, but on dull persistence. Fields were planted, ships sailed, records kept, and distributions made. Each act was ordinary, but their repetition created a structure that lasted for centuries. Even when emperors fell and battles raged, the grain shipments continued, for without them, the empire itself could not endure. To imagine this final scene is to see the whole chain at once. Golden fields swaying in Egypt, barges drifting down the Nile, ships crossing calm seas, warehouses filled with dust and grain, clerks bent over ledgers, and citizens waiting patiently for their share. None of these moments are dramatic, but together they were the heartbeat of Rome. As you drift into rest, picture once more the steady rhythm of the system. The scythe cutting wheat, the sack lifted onto a ship, the sail catching the wind, the grain unloaded at Ostia, the bread baked in Roman ovens. It is the monotony of these tasks that sustained a city of 1 million souls, the quiet strength of repetition that made an empire possible. That is the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you will always have a calm place to return to each night. And now, let us continue our Boring History for Sleep series with the next story, the counting houses of medieval Venice. When we think of medieval Venice, it is easy to imagine the glittering canals, the grand palaces, and the busy markets filled with silks and spices from faraway lands. Yet beneath the glamour of trade and the drama of politics lay something quieter, more ordinary, and far more repetitive: the counting houses. These places, tucked into narrow streets and modest buildings, were the heart of Venice's financial life. They were not glamorous like the Doge's palace or lively like the Rialto market, but they were essential, for it was here that money was tallied, debts recorded, and accounts balanced. The counting houses of Venice were, in truth, rooms filled with ledgers, coins, abacuses, and clerks whose daily work was to turn the bustling energy of trade into orderly records. Their story is not one of sudden discoveries or dramatic events, but of steady, dull persistence, the kind of routine that allowed Venice to rise as a great commercial power. A counting house was not impressive from the outside. Often it was a modest building, sometimes attached to a merchant's home or located near a warehouse. Inside, long wooden tables stretched across dimly lit rooms. On these tables lay piles of coins, stacks of parchment, and wooden counters used for arithmetic. clerks, usually young men trained in basic literacy and numeracy, bent over ledgers, scratching figures with ink quills, adding and subtracting carefully. Day after day, they repeated the same tasks, counting coins, checking weights, recording loans, calculating interest. The smell of ink and wax filled the air, mingling with the faint metallic scent of money. It was not exciting work, but it was the work that kept Venice's economy moving. Merchants relied on these counting houses to manage their finances. A trader returning from Constantinople with silk or spices would not simply sell his goods and pocket the money. He would bring his earnings to the counting house, where accounts were settled, debts repaid, and profits divided among investors. Every transaction was written into ledgers, which became the memory of the business, ensuring that nothing was forgotten and that obligations could be traced months or even years later. These ledgers were the lifeblood of Venetian commerce. Written in neat columns, they recorded names, sums, dates, and destinations. To read them today is to encounter a world of routine. Endless lists of payments received, loans given, goods shipped, and balances calculated. It is monotonous, but in its monotony lies the strength of Venice's system. With careful records, merchants could trust one another, investors could expect repayment, and business could expand beyond what any individual might manage alone. The dull work of clerks gave Venice its reputation for reliability, a reputation that brought more trade and more wealth. Inside the counting houses, tools of calculation were simple but effective. Abacuses with rows of beads or counters were used to tally sums quickly. Weights and scales ensured that coins were not clipped or counterfeit. Wax seals authenticated documents, while parchment rolls stored contracts. Nothing about these tools was glamorous, but together they created a system that worked. Clerks, with their steady hands and cautious minds, formed the invisible foundation of Venetian trade. The atmosphere was one of quiet concentration. Voices were low, interrupted only by the clink of coins or the scratch of quills. Sunlight filtered dimly through small windows, casting long shadows across ledgers. Hours passed slowly, marked not by excitement, but by the turning of pages and the steady accumulation of figures. For the men who worked there, days blurred together, each one filled with the same repetitive tasks. Yet their labor mattered, for it transformed the chaos of trade into the order of finance. To imagine the counting houses of medieval Venice is to see not drama, but diligence. Rows of clerks bent over tables, ink-stained fingers moving carefully, coins spread out in neat piles, ledgers filled with endless numbers. It is to hear the quiet hum of administration, the background noise of an economy that thrived on routine. The counting houses may not have been glamorous, but they were the pulse of Venice's wealth, beating steadily, monotonously, and indispensably through the centuries. The counting houses of medieval Venice did not spring up overnight. They grew slowly, layer upon layer, as trade expanded and the need for order in financial affairs increased. Venice, positioned at the crossroads between East and West, became a hub where spices, silks, and precious metals flowed into Europe. Yet trade on such a scale could not survive on memory alone. Merchants traveling to Constantinople or Alexandria might be away for months or years, and their ventures were often funded by groups of investors pooling resources. To keep track of who had given what, who was owed profits, and who carried the risk, written records were required. The counting house was where these records were kept, where contracts were copied, and where accounts were settled. Inside, the work was routine and repetitive. A merchant would arrive from abroad, weary from travel, bringing his cargo to be valued. Clerks would count the coins, weigh the silver, and note the figures in ledgers. Investors would gather, listening quietly as shares were calculated, each man checking that his portion of profit was correct. The clerk's quills scratched steadily across parchment, adding figures, noting dates, recording names. It was a world of endless lists, but these lists were what allowed commerce to function on such a large scale. In Venice, trust was built not on handshakes alone, but on ledgers filled with numbers. Counting houses became essential not only for merchants, but also for the state. The Venetian government itself relied on them to monitor taxes and tariffs. Duties on goods flowing through the Rialto market were assessed and collected with the same dull precision. Coins were weighed, merchants registered, and officials recorded payments. In this way, the counting houses were woven into the life of the Republic. ensuring that public revenue flowed as steadily as private profit. The daily life inside a counting house was marked by monotony. Clerks arrived early, opened ledgers, and began with balances carried forward from the previous day. Transactions were entered in long columns. So many ducats paid in, so many ducats lent, so many ducats owed. Debts were marked clearly, repayments noted when received. Every page filled with figures, every line checked, and every error corrected before the ledger could be closed. Hours passed slowly, broken only by the clink of coins being counted or the low murmur of discussion between merchants. The work was repetitive, but it was this very repetition that gave the system reliability. Young men training as clerks often began as apprentices, learning first to count coins, then to copy simple entries, and eventually to manage full accounts. Their handwriting had to be neat, their calculations precise, and their patience unending. Many spent their lives in these rooms, surrounded by parchment, ink, and numbers. Few achieved fame, yet without their steady labor, the grandeur of Venetian commerce would not have been possible. Tools of calculation remained simple but effective. The abacus, with its rows of counters, was used constantly, beads clicking softly as clerks moved them to tally sums. Scales ensured that coins were genuine and not clipped. Contracts were authenticated with wax seals, pressed carefully with signet rings, their impressions a guarantee of trust. Each of these objects was ordinary, yet together they represented the structure of a financial world that thrived on order. To imagine the counting houses is to imagine silence broken by small, repetitive sounds, the scrape of quills, the shifting of coins, the turning of parchment pages. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, casting pale light on figures hunched over tables. The air was heavy with the smell of ink and wax, coins and wood. Day after day, the same tasks unfolded, unnoticed by the outside world, but absolutely central to the success of Venice. The counting houses of medieval Venice remind us that commerce is not sustained by sudden bursts of activity, but by endless dull repetitions. Entries in ledgers, coins counted, contracts copied. It was through this persistence that Venice became a power whose influence stretched across seas, built not by swords, but by the quiet strength of numbers. The counting houses of medieval Venice did not dazzle visitors with grandeur or charm. They were modest rooms filled with ledgers, coins, and men hunched over tables, yet they were the hidden machinery that powered the Venetian economy. To step inside was to leave behind the noise of the canals and markets, and to enter a world ruled by numbers, repetition, and routine. Here, the fortunes of merchants and the stability of the Republic itself were translated into columns of ink, scratched carefully onto parchment by clerks who devoted their lives to the dull craft of keeping order. At the heart of the counting houses were the ledgers. Each one, bound in leather, contained endless pages of neat handwriting. Debits and credits filled every line, recording who owed what, who had paid, and who awaited repayment. To the untrained eye, these records looked monotonous, but they were the threads of trust that bound Venetian commerce together. Without them, disputes would have multiplied, investments collapsed, and trade faltered. Every entry mattered, no matter how small, because each one represented real goods: sacks of pepper from Alexandria, bales of silk from Constantinople, bars of silver from German mines. Clerks wrote not with excitement but with patience, for patience was the soul of their work. Transactions were rarely simple. A single voyage might involve dozens of investors, each contributing different sums. Profits had to be calculated and divided according to complex agreements. This required meticulous attention. Clerks checked figures repeatedly, using abacuses to confirm totals, comparing entries across different ledgers to ensure consistency. Errors were not tolerated, for one mistake could ripple across accounts and cause disputes. The process was dull, filled with cross-checking and double entries, but it was the dullness that gave merchants confidence that their investments were safe. Coins, too, filled the counting houses. Gold ducats, silver grosso, and foreign currencies poured into Venice as trade flowed across the seas. Yet money was never accepted blindly. Every coin was weighed, inspected, and tested. Scales sat permanently on tables, their pans polished from constant use. Clerks knew the feel of clipped or counterfeit coins, and their eyes were trained to spot irregularities. Each test was routine, repeated thousands of times, as essential to the system as any calculation. Merchants arriving with bags of coins waited patiently, while clerks sifted through them, counting and weighing, tallying the totals with quiet murmurs. Contracts formed another layer of the counting house's work. Agreements were drafted in long, formulaic language, copied carefully onto parchment, and sealed with wax. These contracts spelled out obligations, interest rates, deadlines, and penalties. They were dull to read, full of repetition and legal phrases, yet they were the pillars of commerce. Merchants trusted their ventures not to memory or to vague promises, but to documents signed, sealed, and stored in counting houses. In disputes, these papers were brought out, their dull wording carrying the weight of authority. The life of a clerk was one of routine. He rose early, entered the counting house, and sat for hours bent over his desk. His days were filled with ink stains, coin dust, and the smell of wax. Lunch was simple, taken quickly before returning to ledgers. The work rarely changed. One day's entries looked much like the next. Over time, years blurred into one another, marked only by the slow growth of records filling shelves. Yet for all its monotony, the work gave structure to the republic, for the counting houses turned the chaos of trade into order. To imagine them is to imagine silence broken by the faint scrape of quills, the click of abacus beads, the soft clink of coins, the murmurs of men checking figures. Light slanted through narrow windows, illuminating parchment covered with neat handwriting. It was not glamorous, but it was enduring, and in its endurance lay the true strength of Venice. The counting houses remind us that behind the glitter of trade and the grandeur of politics was a world of dull persistence, where clerks wrote, counted, and calculated day after day, creating the quiet rhythm upon which the Venetian Empire floated. The counting houses of medieval Venice were not celebrated in songs or depicted in paintings, yet they were the invisible threads that tied the Republic's fortunes together. Within their walls, trade was translated into numbers, trust into ink, and the vast movement of goods across seas into quiet lines and ledgers. The work was not spectacular, but it was steady, and it gave Venice the reliability that made it the envy of Europe. Each day inside these rooms unfolded with dull predictability. Clerks arrived early, opened ledgers that had been left to dry overnight, and began with the previous day's balances. They checked incoming payments, noted debts outstanding, and calculated interest on loans. Their handwriting, trained through years of apprenticeship, formed neat repetitive columns that stretched across pages. They dipped quills into ink again and again, each stroke the same as the last. By mid-morning, the tables were crowded with coins being weighed, contracts being sealed, and merchants waiting for their accounts to be read aloud. The atmosphere was not noisy, but filled with a low hum of concentration. The abacus clicked softly as sums were confirmed. Scales tipped gently as coins were tested, and the scratching of pens filled the silence. Sunlight entered through narrow windows, catching the dust that rose from parchment and wax. Nothing changed quickly, for the work of the counting houses was slow by nature, built on endless repetition. The system thrived because it was predictable. Merchants returning from voyages knew they would find their accounts in order. Investors trusted that their shares had been recorded, and officials were confident that taxes had been tallied. The reliability of the counting houses allowed commerce to expand beyond the limits of personal trust. A man could invest in a voyage to Alexandria, even if he never met the captain, because the counting house would record his share, ensure his repayment, and provide proof of his rights. In this way, dull routines created extraordinary possibilities. The ledgers themselves were the true monuments of the counting houses. Bound in leather and filled with endless lists of numbers, they were stored on wooden shelves in neat rows. Over years, they grew into archives, each one a record of debts, profits, and obligations. To open one today would be to read a life reduced to transactions, a loan for a voyage, repayment months later, a note of interest earned. Entire histories of trade lie buried in these pages, written in repetitive phrases that seem boring but once held immense importance. Contracts, too, filled these archives. Written in formal, repetitive language, they spelled out who owed what, how much interest was to be paid, and when. Sealed with wax, they carried the authority of law. Few were poetic or original. Most followed the same format word for word. Yet this monotony was intentional, for it ensured that everyone knew the terms and that disputes could be resolved by referring to familiar formulas. It was not creativity, but consistency that mattered in the counting houses. The lives of the clerks who worked there followed the same pattern. Many began as apprentices, boys of merchant families sent to learn literacy and arithmetic. They copied figures, swept floors, and watched their elders at work. Slowly, they were allowed to enter transactions, to balance columns, to write contracts. Some rose to positions of trust, becoming managers of accounts or advisors to wealthy merchants. Others spent their lives at the same desks, writing numbers into ledgers day after day until their hands grew stiff. Their names are forgotten, but their work remains in the records that shaped Venice's wealth. To imagine the counting houses is to picture a world of order built out of monotony. Coins clinked softly, abacus beads slid back and forth, quills scratched endlessly, and wax seals cooled on parchment. It was not exciting, but it was dependable, and in that dependability lay the secret of Venice's power. The counting houses did not inspire awe, but they created trust, and trust was the quiet engine that kept the Republic alive for centuries. The counting houses of medieval Venice reveal to us that power often rests not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet, repetitive acts carried out with patience. Every ducat that changed hands, every coin that was weighed, every contract that was sealed passed through these spaces, and in their dull persistence lay the strength of the Republic. A single day inside a Venetian counting house would seem unremarkable to an observer, yet it mirrored countless other days before and after, forming an endless rhythm of calculation and record-keeping. A merchant might arrive carrying a pouch of coins from a recent voyage, its leather worn and heavy with silver. The coins were poured onto a wooden table with a faint metallic clatter, and clerks began their work. Scales were brought forward, coins weighed carefully to ensure they had not been clipped. Abacus beads shifted back and forth to tally the amounts, and every figure was entered neatly into a ledger. The merchant stood waiting as the clerk read the totals aloud, confirmed them, and pressed the seal of the counting house onto a receipt. The entire process was slow, careful, and devoid of excitement, but it transformed uncertain wealth into orderly accounts. These routines allowed trade to flourish in ways that personal trust alone never could. A man might invest in a voyage to the Levant with partners he barely knew, confident that the counting house would record his share, enforce his rights, and ensure repayment upon return. Such arrangements, dull in their contractual language, created networks of trust that stretched across the seas. Without ledgers, voyages might have been limited to a few wealthy families, but with the dull machinery of the counting houses, commerce expanded to include dozens, even hundreds, of investors. Venice's strength lay in this expansion, powered by the routine scratching of quills across parchment. The counting houses also intersected with the life of the Venetian state. Taxes and tariffs on goods flowing through the Rialto market were monitored here, revenues carefully noted and sent to government treasuries. The Republic depended on these dull revenues to fund its navy, maintain its canals, and defend its independence. Officials worked side by side with merchants, ensuring that private profit and public duty were recorded in the same ledgers. It was a system built on monotony, but monotony was what made it stable. For the clerks, life was a long apprenticeship in patience. Their eyes grew accustomed to columns of numbers, their ears to the soft clink of coins, their hands to the steady motion of quills. Day after day, they copied entries, balanced accounts, and compared figures. Errors were caught and corrected, but the process remained largely unchanged. The tools of their trade, the abacus, the scale, the wax seal, were humble, yet in their repeated use, they formed the gears of an economy that spanned the known world. The atmosphere of these counting houses was subdued. Light filtered through narrow windows, illuminating wooden tables scratched by years of use. The air was heavy with dust, ink, and wax. Voices were low, interrupted only by the sound of coins sliding across scales or the faint sigh of parchment being turned. To an outsider, nothing dramatic was happening, but within these rooms, fortunes were being secured, debts repaid, and new ventures financed. The counting houses made possible the glitter of Venice's markets, the grandeur of its palaces, and the reach of its ships across distant seas. The boring history of these places is therefore not a tale of spectacle, but of routine, of ledgers filled line after line, of contracts written in the same words over and over, of coins weighed in silence. To imagine them is to imagine the quiet backbone of Venetian prosperity, Men bent over desks, abacus beads sliding back and forth, coins stacked in careful piles, wax seals cooling on parchment. It was dull work, repeated endlessly, but in that repetition lay the empire of Venice. The counting houses of medieval Venice remind us that the city's greatness did not depend only on its ships gliding across seas or its merchants shouting in markets, but also on the quieter work hidden away in dimly lit rooms. Inside these rooms, every transaction was reduced to figures on parchment, every coin weighed and tallied, every obligation written down. It was monotonous, yes, but it created stability, and stability was the key to Venice's success. The counting houses served as bridges between worlds, between merchants and investors, between private trade and public duty, between the chaos of markets and the order of ledgers. Each day followed a rhythm that rarely varied. A clerk entered at dawn, opened the shutters just enough to let in pale light, and unrolled the ledgers. Coins, still smelling of salt from voyages, were poured onto tables. The metallic clink was followed by silence as scales were set, weights balanced, and sums noted. Abacus beads slid back and forth with soft clicks, guiding calculations. Quills dipped into ink scratched out names, dates, and totals, leaving black trails that bound promises to paper. Contracts were written with the same formulaic language as the day before, and as the day before that, because consistency was more valuable than novelty. Every page looked much like the last, and yet together they formed the scaffolding of Venetian trade. To an outsider, the process might have seemed unbearably dull, but for the merchants who depended on it, that dullness was comfort. They knew that their investment in a voyage to Alexandria would be noted carefully, that their profits would be divided according to the exact terms of their contract, and that disputes could be resolved simply by consulting the ledger. This predictability allowed trade to grow larger than personal trust could support. Men could invest with strangers, secure in the knowledge that the counting house stood between them, its ledgers providing memory that never forgot. The state of Venice also relied on these dull records. Taxes from goods entering the city were noted alongside private accounts. Duties on spices, cloth, and metals were calculated carefully, their figures carried to government treasuries. These revenues funded the ships of the Venetian navy, the upkeep of canals, and the defenses of the lagoon. The counting houses were thus not only places of private enterprise, but also of public significance. Their dull precision fed into the machinery of the Republic, sustaining its independence and power. Life for the clerks was one of endless repetition. They were trained in arithmetic and handwriting, spending years as apprentices before being entrusted with full accounts. Their days were long, marked by ink stains on fingers and the smell of wax from cooling seals. Meals were brief pauses, taken quickly before returning to ledgers that had to be filled. Many lived their entire lives within the world of parchment and coins. Their contributions anonymous, but lasting. Without them, the glitter of Venetian commerce would have been impossible. The atmosphere of these rooms never changed. Sunlight filtered weakly through narrow windows, casting long shadows over worn wooden tables. Dust floated in the air, disturbed only by the turning of pages or the lifting of sacks of coins. The soundscape was quiet, filled with murmurs, the clatter of coins, the occasional sigh of a clerk balancing figures. The monotony created its own rhythm, one that echoed across decades, even centuries. To imagine the counting houses is to picture this rhythm: the scratch of quills, the soft click of abacus beads, the clink of coins, the seal pressed into wax. None of it was exciting, but all of it was essential. Venice's glory, seen in its markets, palaces, and fleets, rested on the quiet persistence of this hidden world. The boring history of the counting houses is therefore not a tale of spectacle, but of endurance, of patience, of routine repeated endlessly until it became the foundation of an empire. The quiet strength of Venice was not in its soldiers or its monuments alone, but in the counting houses, where dull routines ensured the stability of wealth across generations. These houses transformed the noisy exchanges of markets into calm records, reducing chaos into lines of ink. Their work was invisible to most, but essential to all. The counting houses turned trade into something predictable, repeatable, and therefore sustainable. To step inside one was to step into a place where time seemed to move more slowly, where every gesture was deliberate, every calculation checked, and every record preserved. The ledgers that filled their shelves were not just books of numbers, but the memory of the city itself. They recorded debts owed, profits earned, losses endured, and contracts agreed upon. To read them was to trace the heartbeat of Venetian commerce, steady and unchanging. Each page carried names of merchants, partners, and investors, their lives reduced to sums and obligations. It was monotonous, but it was this monotony that allowed trade to stretch across seas and decades. The clerks who filled these pages lived lives of repetition. Each day was a mirror of the last. They entered the counting house, unrolled parchment, dipped quills into ink, and began recording. Their tools were few but constant. The abacus for calculation, scales for weighing coins, wax seals for contracts. Nothing changed quickly, and for the clerks, this was both a burden and a kind of security. They knew what each day would bring: coins to be counted, contracts to be copied, accounts to be balanced. Their work may have seemed unending, but it was precisely this unending nature that gave the system its reliability. Merchants trusted counting houses because they never wavered from their routines. The connection between these dull offices and the grandeur of Venice was direct, though often invisible. Ships laden with silk, spices, and metals could dock in Venetian harbors, only because investors trusted their money to be managed correctly. Palaces rose along canals because profits were divided properly in ledgers. Even the Venetian government drew strength from the counting houses, as taxes and tariffs passed through their records, feeding into the treasury. Behind every ship that left the lagoon, every market stall filled with foreign goods, stood the quiet work of clerks, scratching ink onto parchment in counting houses. The atmosphere within these houses was subdued. Light filtered dimly through small windows, illuminating worn wooden tables marked by years of use. The smell of wax, ink, and coin dust lingered constantly. Conversations were hushed, limited to necessary exchanges about numbers or contracts. The sounds were repetitive: the scrape of quills, the faint clicks of abacus beads, the clink of coins being tested on scales. This was not a place for excitement, but for order, where repetition created trust. Apprenticeship was the usual entry point into this world. Young men from merchant families learned first to count coins, then to copy simple accounts, before eventually being entrusted with full ledgers. Their education was not about creativity, but about discipline, precision, and endurance. To work in a counting house was to embrace monotony as duty. Some clerks rose to positions of influence, advising merchants or even the state. Others remained in the shadows, their names forgotten, their work preserved only in the ledgers they filled. Yet all contributed to the invisible foundation of Venice's wealth. To imagine a counting house in its daily routine is to imagine the city itself in miniature, coins representing distant markets, contracts linking faraway voyages, ledgers binding together networks of trust. It was a world of repetition, but repetition was what gave it strength. The counting houses remind us that history is not only made in grand battles or dramatic speeches, but also in quiet rooms where men wrote numbers by candlelight, creating the stability upon which empires rest. The counting houses of medieval Venice stood as quiet guardians of a system that valued patience over speed, order over chaos, and routine over spectacle. They did not glitter like the mosaics of San Marco, nor did they roar with the energy of ships unloading at the Rialto, yet their quiet persistence allowed both church and market to flourish. In these plain rooms, money was counted, debts tallied, and contracts copied in a cycle so regular that it became invisible, like the steady pulse of the city itself. Within their walls, the Republic of Venice found not drama, but discipline. Every coin that passed through these houses was handled with care. Gold ducats and silver grosso were weighed on balanced scales, their authenticity confirmed before they were entered into ledgers. Clerks leaned over wooden tables, checking totals against previous entries, correcting small mistakes, and cross-referencing accounts to ensure accuracy. The process was not fast, but it was steady, and steadiness was what mattered. Merchants arriving from journeys to Alexandria or Constantinople did not expect excitement when settling accounts. They expected order. They wanted to see their investments written clearly, their shares calculated precisely, and their contracts sealed securely. This dull but dependable rhythm created trust, and trust brought more trade. The ledgers themselves carried the weight of this trust. Page after page of columns listed debts and credits, names and dates, goods and sums. The handwriting was repetitive, the formulas predictable, but this monotony was a strength. By following familiar formats, clerks ensured that no ambiguity existed. Investors could turn to a ledger years later and find their rights still preserved in neat ink. Disputes, when they arose, were settled not by heated arguments, but by pointing to lines in these books. The boredom of the ledgers was their authority. Inside the counting houses, the atmosphere was subdued. Dust floated in thin shafts of light from narrow windows. The air was filled with the faint smells of ink, wax, and metal. The silence was broken only by the scratch of quills, the clink of coins, and the soft click of abacus beads sliding across rods. Clerks rarely raised their voices. Their work required concentration. Merchants spoke in low tones, asking for balances, confirming payments, or arranging loans. The rhythm of the place was slow, deliberate, and endlessly repetitive. Apprenticeship shaped this world. Young men entered counting houses to learn the trade, beginning with simple arithmetic and copying. They practiced writing figures until their hands were steady and their columns straight. Only after years of training were they allowed to manage larger accounts, calculate profits, or draft contracts. Many spent their entire lives in these roles, their days blending together in an endless stream of figures and ink. Their names were not remembered, but the system they sustained endured for centuries. The state itself drew strength from the counting houses. Taxes and tariffs passed through their records, feeding into the government treasury. Duties on spices, wool, and metals were noted with the same care as private loans. In this way, public and private life intertwined, each dependent on the same dull machinery of calculation. The Venetian navy, the maintenance of canals, the defenses of the lagoon, all rested ultimately on figures written by clerks in counting houses. To imagine this world is to imagine the city of Venice in its most hidden form. Not the crowded markets or grand ceremonies, but the plain rooms where repetition created stability. Coins weighed one after another, contracts sealed in wax, pages filled with numbers that looked the same yet carried the power of law. The counting houses remind us that behind the glamour of Venice's empire lay an economy built on patience and monotony. It was dull work, repeated without end, but it was this dullness that gave Venice its strength, turning fragile trade into enduring wealth. The counting houses of medieval Venice, though hidden from the spectacle of the lagoon and the glamour of the markets, carried the same weight as the ships and palaces that defined the city. They were not places of drama, but of discipline, where every action followed a pattern, every page mirrored the one before, and every clerk's day blended into the next. Yet it was this sameness that gave them strength. The Venetian Republic could send ships across seas and negotiate with emperors abroad only because, at home, its wealth was secured by quiet rooms filled with ink, coins, and patience. A typical day in a counting house began with the unlocking of chests and the opening of ledgers. Merchants arrived, often carrying pouches heavy with coins or lists of goods delivered. The clerks, seated at long wooden tables, weighed the coins carefully, testing their quality. Each clink on the scale was followed by a note in the ledger, written in the same practiced hand as the day before. Totals were tallied with abacuses, beads sliding back and forth, and once figures matched, receipts were written, sealed, and handed to the merchant. It was a ritual repeated endlessly, yet it turned scattered wealth into reliable order. Beyond individual transactions, the counting houses were places where complex partnerships were managed. Voyages across the Mediterranean often had dozens of investors, each contributing varying sums. The profits from these voyages were calculated according to shares, and the counting houses were where the tedious arithmetic was performed. Clerks divided totals into fractions, copied the results, and entered them in multiple ledgers. Nothing was left to memory. The repetition was tedious, but it allowed men to trust that their money was secure, even when invested with strangers. This dull reliability was the true foundation of Venetian commerce. The ledgers themselves, leather-bound and heavy, accumulated on shelves year after year. They were filled with lists of loans, repayments, taxes, and tariffs. Entire decades of trade were reduced to columns of numbers and repetitive phrases. Reading them today feels monotonous, yet within their pages lies the true history of Venice's wealth. A single line might record a loan for a ship bound for Alexandria. Another line its repayment months later. The details are dry, but together they map the lifelines of commerce. Contracts, too, piled up in archives, written in formulaic language and sealed with wax. Each was nearly identical in phrasing, but their uniformity gave them authority. Disputes could be resolved by pointing to the familiar wording, unaltered across generations. Inside the counting houses, the sounds never changed: the faint scrape of quills, the click of beads on abacuses, the clink of coins on scales, the low murmur of voices confirming sums. Light fell weakly through narrow windows, illuminating figures hunched over parchment. The air smelled of ink, wax, and dust. To an outsider, the atmosphere might seem unbearably dull, but for those within, it was the rhythm of order. Apprentices learned slowly, starting with copying simple sums, then moving to entries in ledgers, and finally handling accounts themselves. Their training was long, but it prepared them for lives of steady, anonymous work. Many would never leave the world of parchment and coin, their lives marked only by the ledgers they filled. Their names faded, but their work endured in the stability of Venice. The state itself was bound to this dull machinery. Taxes on imports and exports passed through counting houses, their figures feeding into public treasuries. Revenues for the navy, for canals, for defenses, all began as entries in ledgers filled by clerks. Thus, the counting houses tied private profit and public power together, not with spectacle, but with monotony. The boring history of these places reminds us that the greatness of Venice was built less on sudden triumphs than on the steady hum of routine, repeated day after day, year after year. As the long story of the counting houses of medieval Venice reaches its quiet conclusion, we can see that their true significance was never in spectacle, but in their monotony. These were not places that dazzled visitors or inspired poets. They were rooms filled with ledgers, coins, abacuses, and clerks who repeated the same motions day after day. Yet through that repetition, wealth was preserved, trust was built, and an empire of trade was sustained. The glamour of Venetian markets, the fleets that sailed across the Mediterranean, and the palaces that rose along the canals, all depended on these quiet spaces where order was made from chaos. Inside, the routine never changed. Clerks opened ledgers each morning, checking balances left unfinished the night before. Merchants arrived, their purses heavy with ducats or their contracts ready to be signed. Coins spilled onto wooden tables, their metallic clatter quickly followed by silence as each was weighed, tested, and recorded. Quills scratched across parchment, leaving long columns of numbers that looked nearly identical to the columns from the previous day. Abacus beads clicked back and forth, guiding calculations that had been performed countless times before. Contracts were copied in familiar formulas, sealed with wax, and stored in archives. Nothing was new, nothing was exciting, but it was precisely this lack of novelty that made the system strong. The ledgers themselves became monuments of Venice's persistence. Bound in leather and stacked high on wooden shelves, they held the memory of centuries. To open one would reveal page after page of debts, credits, repayments, and obligations. Each line was dull on its own, yet together they formed the invisible scaffolding of Venetian commerce. They mapped voyages across seas, loans that built ships, and partnerships that spanned continents. Though written in the language of monotony, these records carried the weight of an empire. For the clerks who filled them, life was a long apprenticeship in patience. They began as boys, copying numbers, practicing handwriting, and learning to balance accounts. As men, they sat for hours bent over tables, their fingers stained with ink, their ears tuned to the sound of coins on scales. Their days were predictable, their careers largely anonymous, yet their work endured. They were the silent architects of stability, forgotten by name, but remembered in the structures they supported. The state, too, was bound to this monotony. Taxes on goods flowing through Venice were recorded in these houses, ensuring revenue for the Republic. The Venetian navy, the maintenance of canals, the defense of the lagoon, all were financed through figures written patiently by clerks. Private wealth and public power converged in the ledgers, tying together individual merchants and the government in the same dull system. Without the counting houses, the glittering surface of Venice would have crumbled. To imagine them fully is to see not the grandeur of San Marco or the bustle of the Rialto, but a quieter scene. Dust floating in slanted sunlight, coins stacked in neat piles, parchment curling at the edges, clerks whispering over numbers, and the soft scratch of quills filling the silence. Day after day, Year after year, century after century, this rhythm continued. It was not dramatic, but it was enduring, and endurance was what mattered most. The boring history of the counting houses of medieval Venice teaches us that empires are not held together by spectacle alone. They endure because of the dull routines of countless unseen people who write, count, and calculate with patience. Behind every triumph of Venice lay the quiet hum of its counting houses, where repetition created trust and trust sustained power. It is in this monotony, repeated endlessly, that we find the true foundation of the Venetian Republic's strength. Thank you for choosing to spend your night with Sleep Whisper. When you wake tomorrow, may your day be filled with good luck, gentle moments, and success in your work. Until then, rest well, and I will see you again tomorrow night, here at Sleep Whisper.